council members don't eat their snacks, so.
Oh, this is council's? So whose snacks am I eating?
That would be Carl Ward's seat right there.
You ready, Angie?
Okay.
One that's on the angle.
You guys ready? Commissioners, good to go? Hey, welcome to the Cache County Planning Commission meeting for March 3rd. We welcome you, and this evening we have opening remarks and the pledge by Commissioner Lee.
Okay, I would like to read a poem and then pray. This one's called Anyway. People are often unreasonable, illogical, and self-centered. Forgive them anyway. If you are kind, people may accuse you of selfish, ulterior motives. Be kind anyway. If you're successful, you will win some false friends and some true enemies. Succeed anyway. If you're honest and frank, people may cheat you. Be honest and frank anyway. What you spend years building, someone could destroy overnight. Build anyway. If you find serenity and happiness, they may be jealous. Be happy anyway. The good you do today, people will often forget tomorrow. Do good anyway. Give the world the best you have, and it may never be enough. Give the world the best you've got anyway. You see, in the final analysis, it is between you and your God. It was never between you and them anyway. Our Father in heaven, we come before thee at the beginning of this County Planning Commission meeting, and we pray for thy presence here and thy direction and help in the things that we are considering this night. We pray for clear minds and direction that would benefit the county as a whole. And we thank thee for the freedoms that we have and for the government and laws that we have and the people who work so hard to help things go well. And we say this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
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 Please join me in the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God,
indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thanks, Commissioner Lee. Next item on our agenda is the review and approval of the agenda. Any changes to our agenda?
Looking for Chris, but
Commissioners, any questions or on the agenda?
I can't remember why they didn't approve the minutes before. Why we have two sets of minutes?
Two
there was
sets.
a gentleman in the audience who said he had some corrections regarding the Holyoke, or not Holyoke, the RV camper.
Yes.
And he never did submit any changes, so they are just the way they are.
Okay.
In terms of the agenda, though, if there are no changes to the agenda, without objection, we'll adopt tonight's agenda as presented. And then for our review and approval of the minutes, as Melinda mentioned, we have two sets, one from our December 2nd meeting and then from our February 3rd meeting. So any changes to those minutes, commissioners?
I submitted a couple small ones.
Okay. Anything else? If there's not, without objection, we'll adopt those minutes as edited with Melinda's changes, please. We have one consent item tonight and 4 regular action items tonight. Our consent item, these are proposals that have come before us that meet all the requirements and generally don't need to be discussed any further. Is there anyone here in the audience that has any specific comments about the Sharp Mini subdivision? Okay, commissioners, looks like we can have a motion to approve the consent item.
Yeah, and this just is an extension request. It was previously approved. They just need some more time to work on their conditions.
Mr. Chairman, I move that we approve the Sharp Mini subdivision extension request on the consent agenda.
Okay, we have a motion
I'll second that.
and a second. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Okay. So the consent item passes. Our first regular action item is on the Cub River Estates rezone. And so we'll turn to staff for a presentation on that item.
Yeah, as you may recall, this did come before you in December, and the public hearing was held at that time. But it was continued to allow time for the applicant to address the access issue, as any proposed access off of the county road would have gone through a steep slope area. Since that time, the applicant has provided a letter, which is your attachment C, and actually attachment C is the pictures. So attachment D and attachment E, which gave some analysis of that area where the access would be. Our county engineer and fire chief did look at that and said it was feasible to put an access road in there that meets their requirements. However, it still does not meet the county code requirement about not allowing development in steep slopes area. So that is before you. You have the concept plan there. I did just before the meeting upload an updated concept plan that does show the slopes as percentages on the plan. It should be in your shared drive. But as you can see, the analysis on this concept plan does confirm that it does go through the steep slopes, and the cutting and filling to create that would be within that sensitive area, which is not allowed by the code. I believe the applicant's engineer is here to discuss and answer any questions you might have. But other than that, staff's recommendation does remain the same. Recommendation for denial to county council, given that their access is not possible through the steep slope area per the code at this time.
Okay. Thanks, Angie. Commissioners, any questions for staff?
Maybe just a clarification on that as far as code on the steep slopes. My understanding of the code was that it was for placing development on those steep slopes, not access.
So the code reads under non-developable standards and development plan section 1718.050. It's D13 of the staff report. But for steep slope, it says no building, structure, construction, excavation, or landfilling shall occur on any area determined to be a steep slope. So in order for an access, you would have to have excavation and construction and landfilling. So.
I just see that as I mean, that's a fairly regular thing that's done when a road is constructed and accessing these things.
Yeah, I can see where it says in the code if you go by
Yeah.
the wording there, but if you've got an engineer that has, says, oh, we can fix that, and we've taken care of that slope issue, then I can't see that applies the way we.
Yeah,
recorded it here.
and that could be my understanding of the code. As my understanding, I looked at that as, hey, we're not going to place buildings on steep. We're not going to build buildings on steep slopes, but realizing that we live in a valley, we are going to have access through steeper areas from time to time, just to physically be able to access these areas. So I just wanted to bring that up. That seemed maybe not as consistent with what we've done in the past.
I know in the past that there's been circumstances where there's been 30% plus slope and they've been able to eliminate it entirely, and that's been allowed because the safety issue's been removed. It addresses that. Even though there's some question as to if there's a conflict with what the code states plainly read. I think that there may be some other considerations to be had if, as you described, there were ways to engineer or construct around or through that. I'd certainly want to verify some of those things with the county attorney just to know that we're not on the wrong side of that interpretation. Mm-hmm. If it really is ambiguous, then you certainly should default to the property owner. If it's not ambiguous, then it's as it's read. And it's hard for me to say it's ambiguous when it states excavation and filling
Right.
and construction. So that's a challenge to overcome. I'm not saying it can't be, but that's a really good question to have some discussion about.
Thank you.
yeah, certainly with enough engineering and money, you can overcome it through proper design. Yeah, that's the part I had struggled with, is just the wording the way it is. It doesn't seem to allow for a lot of interpretation, the way the ordinance reads now. Other questions or comments?
The comment's just the same thing.
Yeah.
I mean, the engineering shows it is plausible to engineer the fact that engineer a road that can go up there and you get up on top and it is, you know, it doesn't meet those criteria, so.
Okay, well, let's hear from the applicant, who is here, I believe. You want to come on up? Mr. Fielding?
No, Mr. Davis.
Okay.
The owner of the property. I just wanted to raise one point here in the county code and what Angie had sent out. It says hardship relief does allow flexibility if the applicant demonstrates that the regulations imposed by this chapter would deny all reasonable use of subject property. County council, following receipt of recommendation from the planning commission, may modify the exercise of these requirements to provide the applicant reasonable use of property and may provide a modified determination of development potential. That access is the only access that I own into the property. The other ones that I use, and I can't point it out, I don't have a pointer, or I guess I could.
Yeah, he's pointing to it.
Okay, yeah, I see it. And I'm not very good with this. This is a road right here, which is on the east boundary of my property.
West.
No, east. Wait, oh, this is I'm sorry. Here we go. Wrong road. This road right here is one that was brought up, I think, during the last discussion. The only reason I use this, and it's just a small 2-track, is because I lease all of this land to the east of it, which is owned by the Levitt family. So we farm this in addition to my piece, and so most of the time I do use this as an access. Now, let's see, there is a gate and a road right here, which we do use occasionally, moving water, stuff like that. We come up through here with a Ranger. You can drive a pickup up, it is quite steep, but you get the right picture, there's a gate.
Can you point out the location of the proposed access?
It's right here where the pointer is.
Okay.
There's a gate right here that we took out because I would have been violating somebody's rules, because Justin Faison was supposed to build a road there last year for me, and he got too busy. I said, I don't worry about it, we'll get to it in spring, no rush. And I don't know what would have happened if I'd have come to the council at that point and said, well, I've got a road there already, you know. I mean, I don't know, because the problem is these folks here, the family has split this property up, and this is probably the last year I'm even gonna be running that, so I'll have basically no access. That's why I was gonna have Justin build the road for me before I decided possibly just sell this. There is another access right here, which is Larry Rosen's driveway, which I occasionally use. His home is located right here. And he raised the point when he came in during your public comment that he was, you know, all for it as long as I didn't use his driveway. Well, I can't use his driveway. I mean, he lets me go in and out of there to check cattle that I keep in these pastures and stuff. But the only right-of-way or access that I own is this frontage right here that we're talking about. So, by the way I read what the hardship relief would be, you'd be denying me any use, because even farming I wouldn't be allowed to get in there because I can't get equipment and haul hay and such off of that hill, which is why I've always used, I mean, I've run this property for in excess of 25 years. So I never really seen a need to improve my access, because I've always just used oil. In fact, I did improve the farm access because it was kind of clay and slippery, and I gravelled that road and leveled it out and widened it so we could get in and out of the swathers and stuff, you know, fairly wide equipment. But anyway, that's the only point I want to bring, and then I'll let Ben come up and address you, and you can answer any questions he has. But the only access that I own to that property is where we're talking about. So I can't see how you could interpret it any other way than, you know, denying me, I don't know, whatever the wording is there, you know, deny reasonable use of the property. So I would have basically almost, I mean, even for farming, I would have no access if I don't have the right to go across someone else's property. So that's all I have to say. I'll let Ben address slopes and grades and percentages and whatever questions you might have.
You don't have any kind of agreement now in place to use that access or whatever?
The property that I leased, I had on 5-year leases with options to renew. Since the family split it up, they've just gone year to year because they're actually starting to split this they've actually split part of it already. And I don't, you know, they basically told me that just to be prepared not to run it anymore. So, we're on just a year-to-year lease at this point.
Any other questions for Mr. Davis, commissioners? Okay, thank you.
It's all yours.
Please state your name.
Ben Johnson, Todd's asking to do the design for this. And so you can see the slopes that are shown on here, and the minimum slope for a road design on a terrain like this is 10% slope. On a moderate terrain is 7% slope. And you see the future design out here is at a 7% slope. But on this last drawing that Angie uploaded for you guys probably, and I didn't know the meeting was today, so I apologize, Angie, for sending that late, but I thought maybe we could have some use for it. But you can see that point where it shows CLFG, that's for center line finished grade, which is where the road slope is, it's in red. Shows an elevation, that's the rough estimated elevation of what the future design of the road would be at elevation 4599, which is about 10 feet higher than the existing ground right now. So the toe of that whole hill that comes out, you can see the design of the road. If you look on that drawing right there, can you see where it says existing road, where it's dashed on the right of that sheet, yeah, where it comes down and draws? That's where he goes right now, and you can see he drives up on a truck at about a 41% slope, right? That's how I've been going up and down through there. That whole toe of that hill will be pulled off, and all the slopes greater than probably 30%, probably be minimized to about 20% or 0% slope. So that center line finished grade right there will be equal to the grade of, can you see that second to the highest contour line? It says 4055. I mean 4505, I should say, right there. And follow that around over the toe where the toe of that slope is to the right. Yeah, about right there. And my road out there, or the road out in the middle of the design right there, will match that elevation right there. So you can see those slopes, and all 30% slope will disappear from there. And so I think the purpose of the 30% slope is if you were on a hillside like Gibson Mountain, you got a 30% slope. I think that the term for no building or construction or excavation on a 30% slope, because you could steepen the slopes and make it a hazard and make the stability less than what it should be to sustain a slope. And we're going to eliminate the 30% slopes. I think all hazards go away with this. And to me, it's just a logical solution to build an access in there which will lessen the slopes, make it a safer spot, and allow him access on the only piece of frontage he has along Campbell Road there. So I see it as a viable option. I don't see issues with it. And as Chris said, or Andy said, that the county engineer sees that it's doable, that there's not an issue with it. And there's roads all through it. I don't know in this wording, I don't like the wording myself either. It seems pretty broad to say anything above there, no construction allowed. There are roads I could point out all through the county where they've been cut out at a 30% slope to put a 5% road in. And they build I mean, you drive through the canyons anywhere, you can see where the cut and fill slopes are. that they manage down to get to where you can build a design road through there that works correctly. So I don't see any issues with it at all. I see it being a good option for Todd, for his ground, for an access. Like he said, he was gonna just do it in the fall already, just so he can have his own farm road access, and then he's decided to, well, maybe I can do different things with the property, so. Anyway, you have any questions?
Commissioners? Okay, thank you.
You bet.
Anyone else like to comment on this particular item?
Building with Parker Real Estate, and I am the applicant and agent for Todd. And I would just reemphasize, it's pretty cut and dry that this is the only legal access that he has. He's had a use access because he's leased the other ground for 25 years, and that's been the convenient access, but when that goes away, then, without this access, literally this land becomes landlocked if he can't go up and down there reasonably. So I just point that out. Thank you.
Thanks. Anyone else? Okay, commissioners, what would you like to do? Sort of discussion. I can say for my, excuse me, Melinda.
No, go ahead.
I mean, for myself, as a planner, construction on 30% steeper slopes is a bad idea. And of any sort of thing. Obviously with construction, in today's technology, we can change the landscape, but those slopes are oftentimes unstable, and a lot of communities I know require geotechnical investigations and things like that if you want to do it. That's beside the point of, to me, this particular property and the fact that there is no other legal access, but it seems to me, based on the discussion or the presentation thus far. So it's a challenging situation.
Well, I think, we're here for a rezone, which is a little bit different process, but absent a rezone, the applicant could come in for a subdivision for this piece of property with half the number of homes that are potential with this rezone, and we have the same
Still need
issue.
access, right?
We still need access.
Yeah.
And that's the challenge that I have on that, along with the point of we have significant cut and fill work throughout the county. I have this challenge with the code as written, because that's what it says, but the reality on the ground is something very different.
Well, I was the same opinion. I think that this, with the engineering that's available now, they can cut that. It wouldn't be a dangerous slope. And obviously, again, it is his only real owned access to that property, so you have definitely curtailed its use, its value, if you haven't got that access. And whether it's, the rezone, if you didn't even go with the other rezone, why, you still have to have access to it.
And even, a single home on there, which would be permitted, we wouldn't even have to go through a subdivision process, and they've got to have access, and that's.
His farm, you literally, you can drive a pickup up it. There's no way in heck you bring a load of hay off there.
Through
No
that.
way.
Through that, yeah, the way it is
No
right
way.
now. Right.
Yeah.
So he's gotta have a road regardless.
Mhm.
So without the rezone, he can still do he's still gonna create the road. The road's gotta be created, so it's gonna be, the road's gonna be in there, and then at that point, the conditions are they not met? Are we not below the 30, as he's explained it here, we're gonna be below the 30%, the 30% mark.
10% mark, 10% on that road slope, yeah.
I probably should add some clarification there. If they decide just to put a single home up there, they still have to meet those requirements. The 30% still applies.
Mm-hmm.
All that stuff is still applicable. I think it's a good point to raise that this is a a request for a rezone, because we're seeing if this zone fits here. Staff's response there is given the slopes that it may not work because of the slope. So staff's recommendation is for denial. I think it's important also to recognize that this body's responsibility is not to guess at or interpret or make a variance to the code. It's to administer the code primarily. So I think you want to be careful in making an assumption that you can allow something or make a recommendation as though you were issuing a variance as this body. The Board of Adjustment acts as a variance issuing body, and there's specific state requirements that have to be met for that to qualify. So I would just clarify that piece. If you want to recommend this for approval, that's certainly in your purview, but we can help you draft recommendations for why that should be recommended for approval if needed. But presently all that stands, unless we have something on the back burner, presently all that stands is that staff is prepared as a recommendation for denial. They might need to be more specific given the road issue. But just those points, just keep that in mind. And you also cannot set requirements or conditions on the rezone. So whatever your recommendation may be, we'll just have to go as a recommendation, although your conclusion might reflect your intent or thought if you recommend approval.
So is staff saying that because of the access to this, if it were approved as an RU5, there's still an access problem, right? But if they just applied for a building permit, they would be denied a building permit, which is administrative action.
They would have to pursue most likely a variance request to override the code requirement. And then they have to check each of those 5 steps under the state code. If they clear all those, they're fine. If they fail on one, they fail. The whole thing fails. That's how the state sets a pretty high bar for those variances. And so that's why when we look at this as a rezone, that's a considerable hurdle to clear in recommending an approval as staff when we know that there's it's very unlikely to get an access across that steep slope unless there's considerable evidence to support otherwise. So the work that they've done to identify where they might build the road may be helpful in a variance. They'll have to get the right measurements. I know you'll need to get to the 66 feet instead of the 60 to make sure your alignment's correct, and I think you can probably still make that work. But there's some work to be done to clarify what, how, and all those, and that really we don't get into with the rezone.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
You mind if I ask a question
ahead,
of
Brady.
staff? So Chris, the pictures prove it, along with the layout there. That whole I guess my question to you is, if he doesn't access the property from here, where do you suggest he accesses his property?
I don't. I'm not saying I don't want him to use his property, that's not our role to tell him where to get their access from. So we know that there's been previous access from the east. It sounds like that's not really an option, but that's not our role to tell them how to build their property. We're going to administer the code. And so where those two can meet, if there really is an issue with the code language, which it appears to be, then we need to amend the code, not making a variance on the fly to the code. That puts us in a bad position. It puts the county and it puts everybody in a bad position to do that. So if there really is an issue that needs to be addressed, then we need to address it properly. And if the variance doesn't do it, then maybe a code amendment is what's required. So that's why I recommend caution in just considering what that is. I'm not opposed to a recommendation for approval. I'm just making clear why staff has recommended denial because of that significant. And nothing's been presented that would alleviate that concern.
Yeah, can I ask, is that like on your recommendation and conclusion number 1, where it says the applicant has not demonstrated the requirements for hardship relief? I mean, is there a certain form that they fill out? Like, we just did a variance hearing in Hyde Park City, and there's a form that they fill out to officially apply for a variance.
So hardship relief is a different thing. It's specific to Title 1718 for sensitive areas that they can identify. I think the language is, sorry, I'm going to try and pull it up. I got it right, here we go. If the applicant demonstrates that the regulations imposed by this chapter would deny all reasonable use. So all reasonable use is significant. That's a significant change. Currently, I mean, that would mean they can't farm it, they can't do anything with it. It has nothing to do with, I shouldn't say that. It isn't exclusive to development of the property. It's exclusive, it's specific to reasonable use of the property. So if for the last 50 years it's been farmed, our action can't deny them reasonable use, and it does not. So what they could claim, or may claim about, is that because they no longer have access from their previous route, maybe they can make an argument that way that and I'm not telling them to do that, that may be an option. I heard them mention that. Maybe that's something, a claim they could make. But that hasn't been pursued, it has to go to the council, it's a different process. I don't think we've had anyone really pursue that, maybe once. We've had someone pursue a hardship relief under, maybe not, I can't think of what it would be. That would have been back when the council would hear subdivision applications, which they don't anymore. It's been a few years.
Could I make another comment?
If I may.
Hang on just a second, Mr. Davis.
I also know, like in Hyde Park City, we have, we'll have a road and we have really deep lots, and then there's a canal that comes through. And so most people own all the way back to the canal, but some don't. Some own part way back, and there's a landlocked piece that's landlocked. There are no roads that get to it, and those property owners know they just have to wait until someone outside of them somewhere develops to give them access to their land.
That's the same.
That comes with a landlocked piece.
And in this case, they're not landlocked, but their frontage creates a different challenge. I mean, there's a reason why they haven't actively used that route before. It's because it's so steep. It's not a great route. That's why it's been able to function coming from that east side. That makes sense. I'm not criticizing that. That's just what that is. If there's a potential for developing that property, I just want to encourage that proper process, whether they pursue the hardship relief request, right? That's different than a variance.
But a hardship relief request, what's the process for that? Is that just completely separate from,
It's a recommendation.
or is it a result of a denial?
The piece, the only thing we have that references that is it says the county council, following the receipt of a recommendation from the planning commission, may modify the exercise of these requirements to provide the applicant reasonable use of the property, and may provide a modified determination of development potential. Now, what's interesting about that language is that they reference development potential. So this is going to be a question and conversation we need to have with our legal office about how that works. Because development potential is different than steep slopes in sensitive areas in determining how many lots someone can obtain, because a portion of that property is wetlands, and so instead of having out of a 100-acre parcel 10 lots, they only get 90. The last one we did with that was Buena Vista out in Monte Cristo kind of area, and we were able to obtain, that's the one that I'm trying to remember, was the Buena Vista one. They pursued a hardship request, and they were issued and given additional development rights. It did not take away a development requirement over a sensitive area. That's a different request in my mind. It's a harder to obtain request.
And we weren't, they weren't seeking a reason for that.
They were not.
Utilizing the existing zone and, yeah.
Coming in with a subdivision.
And I'm not saying it's impossible, but there's certainly a process that we should pursue. And maybe that's something that can come. I don't know if there's a limiting factor to say that it can't be part of this request, but we certainly haven't noticed it that way. So I'd have just a question for the council on what proper notice would look like, and if we should probably discuss that as part of a meeting and then forward that to the council, or if that needs to come after a rezone, or
Right.
I don't have a clear path that says where they get to apply that.
Okay. So I promise we'll circle back to you, Mr. Davis, okay? Let us talk through some of this. We'll try to get everything out on the table, and then we'll hear from you. But that's back to my original comment was, I think I understand why they would want the access where they want it, and that this is really the only logical place. It's the wording of the ordinance that is the problem. Like, I think we're all poised here to approve this, but for this ordinance language, which would appear, yes, which would appear to prohibit doing what seems reasonable and what these gentlemen have proposed.
But a variance would possibly take care of that. And the
A
council has
hardship request, yeah.
Which one? Those are two separate things.
Well, a variance or
Okay.
either or a hardship.
Well,
Right.
this says right under, A of D, sensitive areas. And it says, sorry. There was a spot right here I read that I thought that said if the planning commission, following the receipt of okay, so if the applicant demonstrates that the regulations imposed by this chapter would deny all reasonable use of the subject property, which we've already done that, we know that there's no other access to it. The county council, following the receipt of a recommendation from the planning commission, may modify the exercise of these requirements to provide the applicant reasonable use of the property and may provide a modified determination of development potential.
Yeah.
So
This is
we could
what
do
I'm trying to
that-
get to.
We can do that
is
right
like,
now.
What,
So reasonable use is not just about development of the zone. That's agricultural use. And so your action isn't preventing them from using the property. The thing that's preventing them is the change of ownership of the other property and their access that they've been using. Is that correct?
but even with, I think what we've heard tonight, though, is that even just for agricultural use, they wouldn't have access if they lose this eastern access, which they have no control over, right? I think we've heard that.
That's
That-
my understanding of it.
They can't, they won't even be able to farm it, say,
That's
for
what's been
example.
stated.
Yeah.
It's not just stated, it's a fact.
So I think what's important to distinguish is you're not considering this for agricultural use.
Right.
There's no
Right.
structures involved there. If they decided they were gonna drive across that, that's a whole different issue.
I think maybe we're at the same place, though, in saying that reasonable use to us would be an RU5 zone. And if it wasn't for this challenge with the way the ordinance is written, I'm assuming, just based on the discussion I've heard, we'd all be favorable for the rezone. Is that right, commissioners?
That's my opinion, yes.
It's my direction.
I'm in favor of it.
I think that's what we would use for our basis, Chris.
Yeah, state that again, sorry.
Well, that we're saying the reasonable use of his property would be for the RU5. In other words, we would approve the RU5 rezone, but for the steep slopes problem.
But that's like
So-
saying, yeah, we approve, let's say, I mean, anything that comes before us, you're saying, we approve of it,
Yeah.
except it doesn't meet the ordinance. Like,
I think what we're saying is, I think what we're going to say is, this use is reasonable, and we would recommend it to the council based on recommend approval to the council based on a hardship request. And I think, Chris, you're wondering, does that need to be a separate process or handled
It might
differently?
have to be noticed separately, and I might come from a different perspective in the sense of, you're not denying any reasonable use of the property by not allowing a RU5 zone to occur. You're just not.
Correct.
And so it doesn't meet the hardship line in my mind, from my perspective. Granted, someone else will have a different perspective on that. But I'd have to see something that could show how it does meet that hardship thing that we've denied all reasonable use of the property. But that's why I feel, a different discussion, perhaps. That's not something that we've discussed in depth, other than it's listed in our staff report as a possibility of something they could pursue. But it's not been requested, as far as I'm aware. So I don't know if I'm just regurgitating what I've already said, and I apologize if I am, but that's my concern, is that I don't know that based on what that states, under hardship relief, they have to demonstrate that the regulations of the sensitive area ordinance denies all reasonable use of the subject property for them to do what they want to do. And that's a very broad brush. All reasonable use is a very broad brush.
But I think we would probably look at that and say, what's the existing use? And it's farming. And if it's proven that they have the potential to lose the existing access, which they don't have control over, it's on somebody else's property, and they want to continue to farm it, they're going to need a new access road. It's probably going to be at this location.
And just to be clear, I don't mean to
Yep.
misstate them or misdirect or, what it is I'm looking for, but when I say that stuff has been stated, that they're losing the access, but nothing's been provided to staff to
Right.
verify those pieces, so I don't mean offense by saying that, that's just what's available
Yeah.
that we can confirm. And so that's something that the commission and the council should be aware of in these discussions. And it's not a reflection of the applicant and what they're proposing, it's just the reflection of what we have to verify and to review.
Okay. So, if I'm not mistaken, this item was continued from December 2nd, probably for up to 90 days or something like that. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I went back and listened, and it wasn't stipulated, it was just to allow time for
Okay.
applicant to provide engineering.
We usually try to put a time frame on it, and I usually suggest 90 days, but I don't remember.
Mr. Chairman, but based on what staff said, we're right there at the 90 days or close to it.
Right.
And what's another 30 days gonna do to change this code?
I don't think that changes.
Huh?
I don't think that changes
30
anything to the
days.
applicant, and, you know, they may be better off with a denial if that's the way, because then they can move on to the next step of appealing that to the.
Right. I was wondering if the commission would want to continue it to allow the applicant to make that detailed hardship request.
But they would
If
make
that
that
was
request,
relevant.
do they make that request to us or to the council?
Goes to you first for recommendation,
us.
and then it goes
Yeah.
to the council.
But normally you would start that process if something was denied.
No, that doesn't require denial.
No.
So you could pursue a variance, and appeals are what maybe you're thinking of, is if there's an action that someone's
Yeah.
opposed to, whether it's an approval or a denial or what have you, then that would trigger potentially an appeal process. Any land use decision would trigger that opportunity.
But us moving it down, keeping it in this body doesn't allow that appeal process to go forward.
Well, and I don't think you're looking for an appeal in this case. So any appeal to a legislative decision is not well-founded, because the council is the legislative body, and if they can make a reasonable decision or support for their decision, a court is unlikely to reverse that decision. It's not a sound practice to appeal a legislative action unless there's probably a very clear, egregious, whatever, can't even anticipate, don't even want to state what that might be, but usually appeals of that don't work very well. So maybe a better option is to consider those, any hardship requests that they might propose, to say that there is a hardship and this is how it can be addressed. That might be something that the commission could consider, and I don't know how really that works with a rezone request, if those are good bedfellows moving forward to the council, or if those are problematic to have them go together. The only one we've had go forward with the hardship request was for a subdivision and not a rezone. And those worked because we were into the weeds a little bit about what the actual details were, how they could be addressed. And the subdivision allows you to impose or address those things with conditions. That's not the case with the rezone.
So, I mean, even, which brings up a question, so even if we were to approve it tonight, and it comes through during the subdivision process, isn't the same ordinance
Same thing.
issue in place?
So that's why the rezone is, that's why staff is saying there's some hurdles here, because you can recommend it for approval, but we're still gonna have to go through all this, and it doesn't appear that there's a good path to approval. If they can't meet the requirements of the code, it's a denial. That's just what it is.
I really think the hardship is the hangup though, because they physically cannot access that property to do anything safely or adequately, like we've already brought up. There's no way you could take a hydraulic swather up that hill that steep, and how you gonna bring a load of hay off of it?
Yeah, I mean, the way I look.
You can't.
At the map that the, staff's provided with the steep slopes, 100% of that roadway frontage has got that same challenge. You can't get across.
I
There's
think
not a gap in the steep slope to get up to the upper part.
in some instances in the past, we've been able to allow some work in those areas if there's an existing road. That's not the case really here. I think,
There is an existing road.
yeah, that's true. And Angie's mentioning the requirements for ag access are different than for other types of things. So when someone's driving up a road that's got 41% slope, that's clearly not meeting any requirements of any standard that we've considered or ever allowed. Just because someone's driven up it doesn't establish it as a road. What we're referring to is the fact that the code stipulates what that requirement is for non-developable areas. So it's not my opinion, it's what the code's requiring based on the planning commission's review and the council's approval. So if there's really issues with the code, that's where it needs to be addressed. They can go through hardship, they can go through variance, and they can all fail. If the real issue is with the code, that's where that needs to be addressed. Otherwise, you're just spinning your wheels, and then you'll go through all the processes, get your denials, and then start with the code amendment. So I'm not saying that's the worst case scenario for an applicant, right? If for example, the commission decides to recommend approval and the council decides to recommend approval for the rezone, now we move to stage 2 or whatever it might be, which is how do you develop the property? Well, then we look at the steep slopes and how do you address the steep slopes within the requirements of the code? That's pretty plainly read to me. If I infer anything else, I'm kind of twisting it a little bit to mean what I want, in my perception, my opinion. If there's any filling or construction or excavation, that covers a lot of bases. That's just very wide-reaching. If that's not the intent of the commission and the council, it needs to be amended. So that's the tough spot you're in. That's what the code says. I think they have a hard time proving the hardship, personal opinion. I think they have a hard time pursuing a variance. There's a chance, but I think it's a hard one. But that's not something that we're proposing. That's not something we're considering. It's not something we've discussed. That's something they'll have to put together and make an argument for.
Chair.
Yes.
Just so I'm clear on this, so the reason why we would not approve it is because of the slopes on it, correct? It's not because of the access, it's because of the slopes on it, correct?
That's correct. That's the way the ordinance is written currently, yes.
So it doesn't matter the access, we're talking about accesses here. The reason why we're not approving this is because of the 30% slope will not allow an A5 to exist with the slopes that are greater than 30%. Even if a portion of the property is developable and everything else, it doesn't matter, we can't approve it. Is that correct, staff? Is that the way I'm understanding it?
If I wanted to take this on a very positive lens and say, RE5 makes perfect sense here. This is a great spot for RE5. We've got it right down the road, it's close to the highway. There's not another great use for this property other than ag. If we want to get rid of the ag, then maybe RE5 is the best option given its proximity to the highway. Well, then you can recommend that for approval to the county council. And then the next hurdle is when it comes to the subdivision process. Well, how do you get to the property? So the rezone itself, you might say, this is a great fit here. Staff's saying we're concerned, or this is an issue because there isn't a way to provide access to the property because of the steep slope and the requirement within the code. So that being the case, why would we recommend approval when we don't see an avenue to provide access to the property in the first place? But you could, from a positive standpoint, say, or from the proponent's benefit, you could say, yes, RE5 makes great sense here. We just need to figure out access. And maybe that possibility is, well, next step is we're going to talk with the council, or we're going to submit an application to say we want to amend the code, or we're gonna pursue a variance, or we're gonna pursue hardship relief. So all those things still happen. None of that changes. All staff is saying is we don't see that.
How do we word this so we get done what we'd like to see happen?
That's a challenge. Mr. Davis, do you want to, did you have something more to say?
Comment?
My name is Joe Chambers. The Planning Commission has been using the terminology approve or disapprove. And I think it's clear you guys, and I think you understand this, but I just want to make sure that the record, all you're doing is recommending
Yeah.
an approval or disapproval. You can recommend it and let the county council deal with the issue if they want to do it. And, you know, with all due respect, as I've been sitting in the audience, it concerns me that the applicant doesn't have the same access that the 10th man or the 6th man does over here at the planning office to lobby and indicate. I think you've hit it right on the point. Whether or not the planning office agrees with you, there's a hardship on this property. And all you do is make a recommendation. Thank you.
Did you have something, Mr. Davis? Come on up.
I may not be as educated as Mr. Harold in what your requirements and what meets certain criteria, but as I read this, and he said that there's been no, I forget the words you used, basically that I hadn't shown that there was hardship or another access, of which I don't understand. You weren't in here when I went over the accesses and explained that to the council. But as I read this, and the path for hardship, which seems very easy for me to understand, it says that the county council, following the receipt of a recommendation from the planning commission. That seems like the path for hardship to me. May modify, then it's to the council at that point, I guess, for me to make my case or to prove my case. And it seems Mr. Harold's trying to talk you out of making that recommendation, or that that's not the path for hardship.
So staff is, you know, they're between a rock and a hard place, and so it's not Mr. Harold's.
I'm just going on what I hear here tonight at this meeting.
Right, right. And there's a lot here to digest on this issue. So anything else, Mr. Davis?
No, just that it seems very clear to me what the path is for hardship.
Okay, thank you. Commissioners, what would you like to do?
Can I just make one more comment on this? If we were proposing building a house on this 30-degree slope, I don't think it would be a discussion. I think the discussion is, it seems that this is really based around access and how that interrelates with the code. And so I don't think, you know, my concern is always on, you know, okay, so if we, you know, you go a certain direction, do you set a precedent one way or another, and then everybody, it's a hardship. It's a challenge there, and that's not necessarily what I'm seeing. Is you know, if somebody has a piece of ground that's a 45-degree slope, we're not building houses on stilts and things like that. You know, that's not my heartburn with this one. Yeah. This seems like a fairly clear-cut access, and maybe my understanding of the code was not what it was as it pertains to the reality on the ground, because it seems that this type of access is done fairly regularly.
If we make a recommendation to the council to approve this rezone, do we need to add any language to that, that we recognize that a hardship must be discussed and approved by the council in order for this to be approved by the council? Do we need to create some wording in there that would follow that?
Yeah, good question.
I think you could go either way. I think you could remain consistent with the code and recommend denial to the council with that same type of.
Yeah, you're asking the same thing. Will the council, approve a-
Consider a variance for this given situation.
Yeah.
And so I think we can be consistent with the code and recommend denial with that same recommendation to the council, that we understand the reason for this is because of this one thing.
That's where I stand.
I would support,
I lean toward
I would
denial because it doesn't meet the
So-
code. Sorry.
You're in favor of, and then let the council decide, which
well, I was
is
just
one of
gonna
my
say, I would support Lane in proposing that we recommend approval and based off of the hardship.
And that's fine. I think it sends a message to the council too, when they see a mixed vote. I think that sends a message as well.
Chair, may I add something here?
Sure.
I understand what was said, that you can recommend, but you as a commission sit here and also need to listen to staff, because we do have an ordinance here.
I agree.
So your recommending almost sends a picture to the council that you're overlooking an ordinance. So I still think you've got to pay attention to the ordinance. Even though we've heard from somebody who says, go ahead and recommend it, but we need to adjust the ordinance before we flow this through, because what happens another time when you come here and there's an ordinance and you're like, well, this makes sense. I agree that Mr. Davis has property rights, but we need to look at the ordinances and adapt them and see where we go. Council, do you have anything to add there?
I agree. I think that your recommendation has to be made in light of the ordinances that we have on the books as written. You do have broad discretion as the Planning Commission to make recommendations, but those recommendations do have to be made under the code as it currently stands.
I'd add one piece. If you pursue the hardship question and forwarding that to the council, you really need to stipulate why you see that no reasonable use is going to be allowed on the property. That's going to be the first question I would expect from the council when I present this on behalf of the commission to the council. And I think it's better for you to have an idea of why you're saying that no other reasonable use is possible and that there is a hardship. Without that, there's not a strong case to present. So,
I mean, as a council, we listen very heavily to you guys and what you do, so we appreciate that. But you're also bound to sit and listen to those ordinances, and that's why we have staff who's bringing those through, who is searching those ordinances and bringing that to your light. It's not there for misguidance or anything else. It's there to help you, help us, and help in order.
Right, and I really appreciate what the staff has done and the way they're able to articulate that, and but it does make it tough for this scenario. Maybe we've got to recommend to the council a change in this ordinance, which is going to be down the road. But you know, where this would come up again, maybe, maybe not. But the way the valley is being developed, I think that's going to come up again. So I think maybe that's an ordinance that we need to address. If we recommend denial right now, then I think you're right in stipulating that the staff is, it's the ordinance now, and we're going against the ordinance if we recommend approval.
well, you're not,
so
though, right? So
Well,
it's a legislative action.
yes,
You're recommending that the zone may work here. You're not saying how they're going to get to the property, right? This is a
Okay.
broad, wide open option. You can recommend approval, you can recommend denial, you
okay,
can recommend.
okay, yeah, I got to back up on this.
Staff's perspective is, if you're gonna recommend approval for this, well, how are you gonna clear the other hurdles down the road? We're not seeing it. So that's what staff's saying. So if you feel that this is a good location for the RU5 zone, then there needs to be something to maybe talk about why it is, for the council's sake, to understand why the commission is recommending that when staff is recommending denial. So there may be a very clear path and reason why the commission wants to approve that, and that works. But I think you want to stipulate what that reason is for the council to be able to understand where you're coming from.
Wouldn't we, I would default to the reasons we gave for Mr. Davis's rezone just down the road,
Across the street.
right?
Good access though, right? No access issues. So I know this has been built around access, and so I think to leave that out of any recommendation would raise a question as to why that wasn't addressed by the commission when staff clearly stated that that was an issue. So I'm just talking you through it, not to say yea or nay, just that's the question that will arise.
Chair,
Yes, sir.
I'm just looking at it, the other side of the road, yeah, it has access, everything else, but the same steep slopes exist on the other side of the road. I've hunted, I can't walk up the other side, you have to get up the other backside of the creek, you can't walk up the backside of the creek without sliding straight back to the bottom. I mean, the same steep slopes exist on the other side of the road. Yes, there is an access on the other side of the road where we approved it. But the same steep slopes exist there as do on the other side that we're looking at here. The difference is there's an access on the other side of the road versus where we're looking at here. Mr. Davis has come to us and said, hey, this is what we propose for an access to get there. Does it show that?
Yeah, I think on that parcel, the steep slopes don't prevent access to the parcel, like.
But the way I went, my original question that I asked before, the reason we can't, we're up in a conundrum here is because the RU5 says 30% grade doesn't fit the criteria. But we just approved an RU5 that had the similar,
That's, yeah, it's-
Well, but we
There's no
we
slope
take
issues.
we take
You
that part of the parcel out of the developable acres.
Do you see my point? But can we not take the steep slopes out of this one where he has an access going up to the top end?
And those wouldn't be developable, you couldn't build a house on it, and that's where my real conundrum is my understanding of the code was, we're not building on these things.
Concerned about structure.
I mean, in my opinion, if we take a really steep, a really hard reading of that code, we couldn't put a culvert in a ditch to get into a piece of property because it's steeper than 30 degrees. You know, I've got a bar pit on the side of the road, and if we really want to read that closely, well, I can't put a culvert in and fill that in to access this piece of property. So that's where my original question came from.
That's a reasonable solution to the access, correct? He's provided a reasonable solution to the access. I'm just trying to like for like.
But in reading the code,
Yeah.
then I think it is.
I understand.
Definitely, if we
Let's put it-
strictly read the code, I think we need to recommend denial. That's where I'm at. I don't think it makes sense with the realities on the ground. And I think the code needs to be corrected.
And that correction comes from a recommendation from this,
Or from the
or
applicant.
this body, or the
Right?
applicant
It
can
doesn't need to
recommend
come
to
from
us.
you. Yep,
Yeah,
it can
okay.
come from you, it can come from the applicant. If it's a priority for you and for the council, they'll consider it, because it doesn't just affect his property, it affects all the properties in the county. This is not just a simple check mark, we can clear it, we can move forward. So that's not just a one and done,
Right,
it's some work. That's fine, but it has implications and ripple effects.
Well, commissioners,
Can I ask one more question?
it seems like there's gonna be differing of opinions up here. One more question, Mr. Davis, come on up.
Well, my point being, what is the path for hardship? No one's answered that question. What is the path for hardship if it says that has to be on the receipt of a recommendation from the planning commission. Am I correct or incorrect? Correct. So that's the only path I have for hardship, is a recommendation from this council or commission, then goes to the county council for me to make my point. Am I correct or incorrect?
That's correct.
Sounds right.
Okay. That's all I would say.
But even then, with that, we could still suggest that this be reevaluated so that it's not just an open-ended future problem.
I mean, hardship is going to have to be looked at very deeply, as just what you're talking about is the definition and everything else there. As I read inside of there, any reasonable use of the property. So what hardship are we talking about here? So hardship isn't the pass to get this done. I think the whole situation is getting the ordinance as a reviewed. So even if you say to hardship, now we got two things to consider as a council. We can't pass this because an ordinance sits in front of us and we're the legislative body for the county. Plus then we got to sit and decide what is hardship and work that out. So there's some issues there.
Can I just bring one other point? Okay, in the staff recommendation, it says that 4 homes could be built on the property without a rezone. That's a reasonable use.
I think they're giving an alternative based on acreage, not an approval for.
It wasn't an approval, I'm just saying, what is a reasonable use? It says, I gotta find the wording, but on my glasses, I have a hard time seeing, but anyway, it talks about a reasonable use. Without a rezone, 4 homes would be a reasonable use.
A reasonable use, but there are other
Yes,
reasonable uses.
farming is a reasonable use.
Correct.
You cannot get farm equipment in and out of there, but that's a story for another day. I'd have to come in just to say, can I build a road to get to my property? Because if I'm understanding correctly.
That's what the code requires. That's correct.
With your interpretation of the code, I would say it is a little bit broad in its, I agree with a few of the commission members that the code may be a little bit broad.
That's my statement also.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, I guess it depends on what a reasonable use is. But the only path that I see, which you agree with, if I understood you correctly, is for the commission to make a recommendation, then we take the next step. Am I right in my?
Yeah, regardless of what we decide, it goes to the council for the next step, so.
Well, if you denied it.
If we deny it, it still goes to the
Still goes
council,
to them.
and they can approve it.
It still goes to them.
They- So, yeah, I was gonna mention that, Mr. Davis, I mean, it's not over.
That's not how the hardship works. It says after a recommendation.
That's right, and they could, you know, if you make, solid arguments and persuade the council, they can send it back to us,
That's for the rezone or the hardship.
yeah.
Council's the deciding voice.
Yeah.
Recommendation can be denial or whatever else is what the recommendation can be. It's still coming to the council. So there is a recommendation coming from this body.
Just to be clear, that's not what the code says though, as far as hardship. It says after, following the receipt of a recommendation, not a denial.
No, a recommendation for approval or denial.
Okay,
So
then I
there's
can
just
go
a-
either way.
Yeah, there's
Okay.
misunderstanding. It's crossing wires here.
All right, just wanted to be sure. I don't want to.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. I think you've got 6 commissioners up here that sympathize with your situation. I mean, because we've been here talking about it for an hour and 20 minutes already, or 10 minutes, we're trying to figure this out. And I think we don't like it when we run into a situation where the wording won't work in this particular situation. So it's a struggle for us, I can assure you.
But that's why we have this process to work
It
through
is,
it.
yep, and if if it's a couple of denials along the way, there are other avenues to pursue to come in and try again, so. Commissioners, might be good to start thinking about a motion.
I've been thinking for a while, and that's why I'm not gonna make one, because I can't think of the.
Plus, I respect what we have, I mean, it's, the ordinance is there, and if we go against that ordinance, I think I would recommend denial of the rezone and a recommendation to the council that they look at a hardship, or, maybe that can be there too, hardship, that would give it approval, or an ordinance adjustment or change in an ordinance and description. Would that wording work?
I need to
Probably
make a
not.
clarification.
Go ahead, Chris.
The code doesn't restrict you from making approval or denial. All that staff is saying is down the road, the code will have an impact on what you can do.
Correct.
And so your decision tonight isn't based on what that specific code requirement is. It could be, but that shouldn't be the basis for your decision in the sense of the code is requiring you to deny the application or to deny the request or approve it, whatever it is. Rezones are a little more fluid than that, than just to say the code required me to say this. Really, you're making a determination if the zone makes sense here. And staff is saying it's a challenge because of the access. You might say, yes, it makes sense here, access can be resolved. I mean, that's as basic as
Yeah.
and probably too simplistic. But that's kind of the opposite side of that coin, is saying this, staff is saying this, but we're saying it's possible. Let's figure out how it's possible. So that's an option to consider without going into the detail of what code says, might give you that ability to forward that recommendation to the council. And my hesitation, just for clarification from Mr. Davis's comments, and maybe also some thoughts from the commission, is relating to the hardship piece, is we haven't run a hardship with the rezone together. I'm unaware if there are issues attached to that from a process standpoint. If that will create issues with, do you need to hit a decision on the rezone first or the hardship first, or can they happen at the same time? Rezones tend to happen at here, and hardship's more down in this area, closer to where you'd consider a subdivision or development of the property, not just a rezone of the property. So there's a little bit of a question in my mind of what goes first. So that's my hesitation on what should occur in that process.
So, Mr. Parker, staff has the recommendation and conclusion for denial and the written recommendation there. Are you comfortable with that language, or would you like to change that language in some way?
I guess the way that's written, it's not demonstrate a recommendation for hardship, but he could demonstrate that to the council, possibly. So I guess I could go with that recommendation, number one.
Okay, so is that, would you say that's your motion then?
Yes, make a motion that we deny the Cub River Estates rezone based on recommendations and conclusions, which are just one.
Okay.
I would second that.
So we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion, commissioners? Okay, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, Mr. Davis, you've got the county council, go before them. They're elected, and they have to consider your input even more than we do. So, thank you.
I think the dates on that right now, typically we'd set the hearing with them on the 15th. They would hold a hearing on the 29th of March. So by the end of the month, it should be the council for their consideration. That would give you a little more time to think about that hardship question and how you might address it to the council.
Okay, I have some thoughts.
Yeah, I think you have some options, so be sure to explore those fully.
I want to get my own legal interpretation it seems very broad to me.
Okay, well, appreciate your time tonight and your patience with us. Okay, Commissioners, the next item on our agenda is the Holyoke Airport Conditional Use Permit. Staff, would you like to start this item with a presentation?
Gonna see if that, there it goes, okay. That's not what I wanted to do. All right. I'm gonna provide I know we sent out about 100+ pages in the staff report reflecting all the discussion that's been had, previous permit information. There's a lot of stuff in there. My presentation today is maybe 7 or 8 slides. So what I'm going to do is walk you through the specifics of the staff report, why this is an issue, what's come up, why are we talking about it, and what the revocation process is, and what staff's recommendation is. So that's just a brief overview of what we're going to cover there. So as we look at this purpose, so first of all, there was a single-family dwelling recently constructed on parcel 111433. I'm going to show you at the next slide a picture of this area. This dwelling is directly south of the property where the existing Holyoke Airport conditional use permit is located. So these are just, I'm reading off some of the bullets here. As you look through the staff report, you're going to see those same things. You can see the area that we're talking about. This is just northwest of Mendon. It's part of an existing subdivision, Pheasant Ridge subdivision. That's where the conditional use permit is located. Let's see other details I want to pass your way before moving on there. The third bullet I point to is condition 8. So we know, first of all, that there's a dwelling built. It's in this, just south of the airport. Condition 8 of the Holyoke Airport conditional use permit states that if any structures are built within the noted runway areas and zones, the Holyoke Airport conditional use permit must be reconsidered by the Cache County Land Use Authority. That's the Planning Commission. Fourth bullet point, the recently constructed dwelling is located within the runway protection zones of both the approach of runway 36 and departure of runway 18. So if that's confusing at all, the runway distinctions are based on the fact that whether you're approaching from the north or the south determines which runway you're using. It's the same landing area, but your approach direction or declination determines what that is. The review of county staff indicates that the Holyoke Airport is no longer able to comply with the requirements of the county land use code. So that's just a very brief summation of what the issue is. If we look at that area, I asked our GIS team to take a peek and see if they could find any current photos, if anything's been flown recently over that area so we could see the house, besides staff's assumption of where the home is. Let's see if I can zoom in on that, maybe not. So this is
part of the staff report, because this seems like it's new information.
So this, I'm happy to address that later. If you want to address it, that'd be great.
I just haven't seen this.
This is what I asked our staff, our GIS team to produce. I asked them today to review that and see if there's any new stuff that's been flown. I felt pretty confident about where we had assumed where the home was built because I went to the site. I made some measurements based on where the proposal was, and it's pretty close to where staff had indicated. It looks like it's a little further south than what staff had indicated on the previous staff report. But this aerial imagery is just an update from the imagery we already have. The other zones and everything that's identified here is what was previously identified. So that information is just identified to show where the runway protection zone is in relation to the existing structure. And maybe it's a difference of 50 feet or something like that to the south. So that runway protection zone is what we're talking about, that purple area, and it's hard to see, but there's another zone underneath it that's a different hatch depending, again, whether you're leaving or you're taking off or you're departing from that runway. So when we look at revocation of a conditional use permit, the code stipulates how the commission can look at those or consider a revocation of a permit. It states if there is a cause to believe that grounds exist for revocation of an approved conditional use permit, the land use authority shall schedule the item for consideration at a public meeting. So you set that up, and we started to look at that last year. And the decision was made to allow additional consideration or due diligence process to make sure there was adequate process and time for the proponent to consider what was being, well, to look at what was being considered and to provide additional comment and information. So what this states is a minimum notice of 30 days prior to the meeting shall be provided to the property owner at the location of the approved conditional use permit. That section continues and reads, a conditional use permit may be revoked, not must, but may be revoked by the land use authority if the land use authority finds that one or more of the following conditions exist. So you'll read through these A through E, so there's 5 options that you may consider if you decide to revoke a permit. A, the conditional use permit was obtained in a fraudulent manner. You'll note in the staff report, we went through these same specifics. Item A is listed as E number 1 as a question. Was the CUP obtained in a fraudulent manner? No, it was not. Staff has not identified or doesn't feel that that's the case. Item B is number 2 under E. The use for which the conditional use permit was granted is ceased for a minimum of 12 consecutive calendar months. Staff has identified that no, there is not sufficient evidence to make this claim at this time. The reason it's phrased that way is staff is aware that there's been question about if it's been used. The burden, from my perspective, is the burden is on staff to prove that it has not been used. We're not comfortable making that assertion. We don't have evidence to say it hasn't been used for a full 12 calendar months. That's a difficult case to make, I find. It might be the case. If there's more information that becomes available, maybe we could make that case. But based on what we have now, I'm not comfortable making that case. The third item is C. The nature of the use for which the conditional use permit was granted has changed, or the intensity of the use has increased beyond that originally approved. No, there's not been a change there. D, number 4, the use constitutes a nuisance as defined by the county code. Again, staff says no, this doesn't qualify as a nuisance based on the requirements or the definitions within county code. Item E, or number 5, one or more of the conditions of the conditional use permit have not been met. And the question that's asked under number 5 is a little different. It says, have all the conditions of the conditional use permit been met? And the answer is no. So what that indicates is there are conditions that have not been met. Condition 1 of the conditional use permit specifies that the proponent or the holder of the CUP must meet all applicable standards of the Cache County Code. And what's applicable here is under the definition, the use-related definition for private airport 5810, number 2 states, a copy of the design criteria as per the current FAA Airport Design Advisory Circular, AC 150/5300-13A, as applicable to the type of aircraft proposed to operate at the site. Said design criteria must be implemented at the site. I feel like I missed a sentence in there. As staff looks at that, I'm going to skip to the next slide here. As we talk about if those conditions have been met, we're talking about that runway protection zone. We look at condition 8 under the conditional use permit. I think what's important to look at when we consider the purpose, or when we look at that and the applicable zones and areas attached to these runways is the purpose of that runway protection zone, or RPZ, as it will likely be referenced by myself and others. The purpose of that is to enhance the safety and protection of the people and property on the ground. It also states in that same circular that the function of an RPZ is to enhance the protection of people and property on the ground. This is best achieved through airport owner control over RPZs. Control is preferably exercised through the acquisition of sufficient property interest in the RPZ and includes clearing RPZ areas and maintaining them clear of incompatible objects and activities. Based on staff's review of what the circular requires or considers for runway protection zones, and also based on another piece that the FAA released, FAA memorandum called Interim Guidance on Land Uses Within a Runway Protection Zone. They issued that with the intent to clarify incompatible objects and activities. So if you're following with the staff report, page 5 rolling to 6, this FAA memo indicates that for new or modified land uses, buildings, and structures, let me read that again, sorry.
Structures is not part of your list. I got stuck on this when I read it too. The FAA
buildings,
memo
sorry, I just crossed
indicates.
it out. I was like, I have something wrong in there.
Yeah,
Are incompatible land uses in the RPZ. The FAA memo states that it does not address incompatible objects for existing land uses, so I've attached that as a copy, but staff's determination is that single-family dwellings are an incompatible object in the runway protection zones. And I don't think that's a question. I think that's pretty clear with the intent of the RPZ and with the statements issued by the FAA that those uses don't belong, are not recommended in this circular to be within the RPZ because of the safety issues. At the time the commission acted to, the other piece I think is important to recognize as we have this discussion, is the recognition on the part of the proponent that the likely revocation of this permit is the likely revocation of this permit if there is something built within these zones. At the time the commission acted to approve the conditional use permit, the proponent, Rachel Holyoke, stated that the possible revocation of the CUP made sense in the case of development occurring on surrounding properties as follows. We're fine to stipulate that the development of any of the properties around us would take precedence to the airport, and we would need to readdress whether that's to shorten the runway so that we can meet the zones. And that did occur after this meeting, because that was part of the discussion. The initial proposal was for 1,300 linear feet of runway, and that was shortened to 640. It could even be shortened to 625, I think, based on what the parameters we were looking at the time. So that was one thing that was pursued to shorten the impact of those runway protection zones in other areas. Or whether it's the conditional use is restricted or revoked. We don't have any issue with that. That makes sense. Right now, those properties are undeveloped, and we don't believe we'd be any nuisance to the property owners. I think that makes sense at the time that was stated, it made sense to make that statement given the fact that there weren't developments occurring, there weren't homes going up right across the road. And so I understand where that comes from, but I just want to point to it that was a clear understanding at the time. That was a possibility. It was also discussed by the commission at some length. And as you review that information I provided in your packets, that's also provided there. So having gone through all these pieces, and considering the requirements found in the county code and the purpose of the runway protection zone, the staff's recommendation and conclusions you'll find in your staff report is that the permit be revoked. And this is based on the fact that the conditions of the conditional use permit have not been met. Condition 1 of the conditional use permit specifies that the proponent must meet all applicable standards of the Cache County Code. The County Land Use Code makes the requirement that they have to meet all the design criteria at the site. And if they can't do that, then it makes sense that the permit be revoked. The second piece is due to the location of the new and existing structures on this and the surrounding properties. It is not possible for the existing Holyoke Airport to meet or implement the required design criteria in compliance with the county land use code. That's where staff came down in our review and consideration of the revocation. We've had multiple discussions that again have been provided with you, and I'm happy to address those if you have questions specific to those. But as a general overview, I thought it would be helpful just to talk through what staff's viewpoint is and what their review indicated for a recommended action.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Counselor, is there a few things you'd like to say?
Yes, so it has been mentioned in the past by the county attorney discussing the possibility of maybe modifying or amending the conditional use permit all as one process. But the county code act states that no use approved as a conditional use may be modified, enlarged, or expanded without obtaining an approved modification to the permit. The application for a modification shall be processed as a new permit application under this chapter. So, despite any comments to the fact that it would be nice or convenient to amend a conditional use permit as part of this process, our county code, as currently written requires that any amendment be submitted as a new application.
And a minimum being any of these options where we're tweaking the RPZ zone or runway location,
yes,
that sort of thing.
An amendment to the use, a modification or expansion of the use.
Okay, anything else?
I did want to also mention that as the Planning Commission, you have a great deal of latitude and discretion in where you gather your evidence from. The Utah Supreme Court recently stated in a footnote in one of their decisions that although the third parties that are not the proponent of the CUP don't have a per se due process right to offer evidence, that does not mean the Planning Commission cannot or should not choose to allow other parties to participate in the revocation hearing or consider evidence from those challenging a CUP. In fact, in some situations, it may be arbitrary and capricious for the Planning Commission to make that decision without taking that evidence into consideration. So, in a formal hearing with a judge and a jury, there are certain rules of evidence that the different parties have to abide by. Those same rules do not apply in this situation. So I just wanted to remind the Commission of their ability to gather evidence from a variety of sources.
Okay, thank you. Commissioners, thoughts? Initial thoughts?
I have one question.
Yes.
So Chris, when you read that one part where it said, in considering these, that the Planning Commission may revoke it, why do you think it says may?
You're not required to. You could act not to revoke the permit. I think that's important because it's an established right under the law that they can have that use as a conditional use and you've already approved it. So to revoke that would really have to have some reason as to why you were revoking it. So the may gives you the latitude to do it or not to do it, based on those list of things. You don't have to. There would have to be substantial reason not to do it. So that's really gives you the deference, like council has said. You have a lot of latitude on what you might decide, but it's also latitude in the sense that may is written there, not must.
Thank you.
Could I just clarify a little bit on that then as well? In this zone, in the FAA, are there specific rules, regulations that say there may not be structures in that zone?
In the runway protection zone, correct. It restricts those from
So,
occurring.
so there is a legal requirement that says for that, there may not be,
So it's the county code has adopted their the circular as the requirements for runways in the county. So in the runway protection zone, while it says, let me go back here.
what you're looking at. My
I
question
don't
is
have it on
really,
the
is
slide,
it,
I have it in my notes, sorry.
is it out of compliance with FAA regulations as it is currently constituted with this there?
It's out of compliance with county regulations. Yep. The
Because
FAA's
we have specified within there that that circular
correct.
is the regulation that we follow, or the, okay.
Yeah.
You're the land use authority. The FAA is not going to tell you how to address your land use requirements. Just like you aren't going to be able to direct the FAA into what can occur in airspace. Granted, it's the federal government versus a planning commission, so that's a little bit of not a fair comparison. But that requirement is within the county code that's been adopted, and that piece of code applies the FAA circular and the requirements within it to apply to land use requests specific to private airports in this case.
Okay, other questions or comments? Okay, commissioners, what would you like to do as far as hearing from the applicant and collecting that additional information? Thoughts?
Chair, we've gone over this multiple different times. Is there much that we haven't heard already? I don't know, but it's pretty extensive. There's what we've seen in the report here, I think it's there, so I don't see any.
What's our obligations, counselor, for hearing from the applicant?
Well, so the standard for is that the applicant has a reasonable opportunity to be heard, and that reasonable opportunity, what constitutes reasonable, is open to interpretation, and I think that it would be, in my opinion, it would be fair since staff has had an opportunity to at least summarize their arguments that have been made over the past several meetings. I think in the interest of fairness, I think it would be fair to allow the applicant at least some time to summarize arguments, even if those arguments have been previously made, and possibly to restate possibly new points that they have generated in the interim.
So can we put a time limit on that? Is that?
I think we can.
I think that's fair. I think that's a good option.
And maybe really the comments need to be germane to the main point that we're looking at, and the reason why we're looking at revocation. The rest of that is, we've heard that, and it's really not what's on the table.
Okay, with that guidance and direction, what should we request in terms of a time frame here?
30 minutes?
Okay, that's that sounds reasonable.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
is anybody else come here tonight in favor of or opposition of? Would we allow them same time a quick statement or?
I think we would. Are you folks here for this particular item as well? Would you like to make comments tonight?
That option open.
Okay, all right.
We got one more over there.
Yes, sir?
Oh, he's saying he's here.
I'm here for it and possibly make comments.
Okay, all right. So with that in mind, Commissioners, should we start with the 30 minutes and?
I would, yes, I would make the proposal that we use 30 minutes to have the applicant make a statement.
Okay, and Ms. Holyoke, I'm assuming Mr. Chambers is going to speak on your behalf tonight.
Actually, she's gonna be doing the majority of the speaking.
Okay, the time is yours.
Let me indicate to you that, as you probably know, Chairman, I talked with John Luthi yesterday, trying to make sure that we didn't have a lot of legal rambling going back and forth as far as the procedure. And so I called him and we had a very nice discussion. I indicated to him that because the Cache County ordinance incorporates the FAA circular, which is 300 pages, that in order for me to educate you as to why we think that we comply with the Cache County ordinance and the incorporated circular, FAA circular, I would probably need 2 hours. And he indicated to me on the phone, and Taylor was there, he indicated that he understood that 2 hours would be reasonable for that. And so I just make that statement at the very beginning. Mrs. Holyoke is going to talk to you about the slides which we have given to the county. I sent them over to Chris, and I don't know if he can put them up there for the public. If not, they're in a PDF form in an email I sent you.
I'll see if I can download them and you can work through.
Let me just give you some background on Mrs. Holyoke so you understand what you're going to hear from. She's an engineer over at Northrop Grumman, and they do rockets. They do engineering design, and she's very familiar with the regulations, and she's read through the 300 pages, and we disagree with the planning office's conclusion that we cannot meet the design criteria. Prior to January, she supervised 32 employees, 16 inspectors, and who were constantly going back to the governmental regulations and engineering designs, and 16 engineers. She was promoted as a chief engineer in January, and her work that she does in that capacity affects the company widely. Over 90,000 employees take the information that she provides them in that capacity. So with that in mind, let me just make sure you understand. The county council, and by the way, Councilman Gunn, I was not saying that they should disregard the ordinance. I was just reminding them that they could make a recommendation to deny or approve, and you're right, I probably slanted it in the approval problem. John, and I wasn't trying to. I just was trying to remind you that irrespective of what they do, it's a recommendation. So it was done for selfish purposes because I wanted to move on and get down to this matter. Although I do have a lot of property rights, leanings towards property rights. So with that background in mind, the complication that is created in this is Cache County, by their definition, incorporated these 300 pages of the circular, and section 1707.030 in its use-related definition for private airports. And again, we talk about in private airport, this is a landing strip. It's not an airport. It's available to pilots as an airport, but it's really basically a private landing strip. They indicate a copy of the design criteria as per the current FAA Airport Design Advisory Circular, AC 150-5300-13A, as applicable to the type of aircraft proposed to operate at the site. Set design criteria must be implemented. And so with that background in mind, I want to go through these pages for you, and I may interject as necessary to clarify.
All right, I appreciate the opportunity to talk to the commission. I do want to make it clear I am not an aviation expert. I worked in the aerospace background, but I'm not trying to represent myself as an aviation expert. I am trying to say, this is the knowledge I have as the CUP applicant. And there are some things in here that I believe staff has overlooked, and as I pointed those out, they don't ever seem to come out in the staff report. But staff has told me that I need to talk it with the planning commission, and I do think there's a basis here for which the FAA circular has not been followed on the county side of this process, and there are things that the circular allows that you're not considering. So with that, let's go ahead and go to the first page. I believe you've been briefed on this. I do just want to touch briefly. I have not seen actual evidence that the home was in RPZ until the meeting tonight when that was presented. So some of this you're going to see is, one of my positions was there was no proof where in the RPZ it was or if it was even in the RPZ. So,
And I have a concern about that from a due process standpoint, because we're to be given 30 days notice on that. We get the staff report 5 days before this meeting. It's not in the staff report. My client had a conversation with Chris before that. What is the evidence that it's actually in there? And we had no evidence prior to that, although Rachel has adjusted her presentation to indicate that if it is in there, there are still options available. I apologize.
you're fine. The last part, on the very last bullet, I would like to just add some clarification. In 2016, when this was approved, I definitely did not want to restrict someone else's ability to build on the property as they saw fit. And so at that time, we felt like we need to let that play out. And depending on where someone builds, depends on what our options are. Given that we know where it's built, we now know what options are available. And so while I was fine to stipulate revocation if it was built in a place that absolutely couldn't meet, my statement included a change or a restriction, and you're gonna see some of the options I propose that meet are simply restrictions to current uses. And so let's make sure as we talk that it's clear, my intent was to not limit what the property across the street from us could do, but it was also to say if it's still allowed, let's continue to use it. Because the FAA would say maximum use of the airspace. So, the conditions, I think Chris has covered very well. So this is the actual wording in the land ordinance. And it does incorporate that circular as applicable in its entirety. And it is 300 pages. I was going to bring you a 300-page paper copy just so you could get a feel for the magnitude, but I think you can envision that. This is a 50-page pitch. So you can put 5 of these together, and that's how many pages of requirements there are, and it's not big font like this presentation is. Okay, I think it's always good to start these discussions with where do we agree, so we don't have to adjudicate something we both agree on. So I do agree that the FAA circular is a requirement, and I do agree that if a structure was built within the RPZ, that we have to reconsider. So we don't have to discuss those, I'm in agreement on those. Now you're going to see several pages where I disagree. In the interest of being shown that you have imagery that shows it is clearly in the RPZ, we will skip the first 2 bullets. But the third bullet, which is the circular Chris references, I've given you all the references to the pages. It says, when you have an incompatible use, see the memorandum. Chris referenced that. But if you look over at the table of the memorandum, it doesn't say automatically it's incompatible. It says land uses requiring coordination with, and it gives an adjudicative body that the FAA uses. And so, while staff has determined it's an incompatible use, the code that you have put as the requirement says it requires coordination with a body that the FAA works with. And so that's the first thing I want to bring out in this, is it's not a blanket, definitely incompatible, and we'll talk a little bit more in just a little bit. The next thing, I do think it's worth educating on some of these things as we have a discussion. I will try and make it brief, but please feel free to ask questions. So this is the definition out of the circular on what a runway protection zone is. It is an area to enhance the safety and protection of people and property on the ground. You can see that there are 2 portions. There is a central portion, which tends to be straight off the runway, and then there's a trapezoidal portion. And within the circular, and we'll talk this a little bit later, there are some different compatibility uses depending on whether you're in the central portion or the controlled portion of the RPZ. Another one just for reference, in the staff report, it talks some about the aircraft. I just want you to know, regardless of the aircraft used, up to the maximum aircraft or the most demanding aircraft we originally stated, the requirements stay the same, and they are the column that is highlighted in blue. Okay, the next slide then. Again, I did not see that we have clear evidence that was in there until today, so you can see the first bullets relate to that need. However, the next bullets go through the fact that there is a central portion and a controlled portion. I want you to also note, we're going to talk about airplane patterns here in a little bit. The circular assumes that RPZ has traffic entering from either direction, right or left, and we're going to talk about why that's important in a little bit. So keep in mind those winged areas assume entry from either direction, okay, in the circular. So this gets to the point then, that gets to the first argument of not having clear evidence. I assume that you may say, well, even if there's no clear evidence, we'll be back here in 30 days, so then what? So even if the home is verified to be built within the RPZ, there are 2 of the 4 existing uses that are entirely unaffected. I'm going to walk you through that. So the current configuration, you have a runway safety area that requires 240 feet beyond the runway on both the north and the south. The runway protection zones start 200 feet after the end of the runway on both the north and south. There are 2 runways. They're referred to as 1-8, which is southbound, and 3-6, which is northbound. They are mutually 640 feet, and I want you to keep in mind the distance from the south Holyoke property line to the north property line is approximately 1,312 feet, and that was confirmed by an April 2021 boundary survey. Questions on current configuration? Okay. So taking staff's picture, this makes it clear that on these RPZs, the RPZ on the north is the departure RPZ for runway 36 and the arrival RPZ for runway 18. On the south, it's the departure RPZ for runway 18 and the approach RPZ for runway 36. A few other things just for clarity. The number you first cross, whether taking off or landing, determines which runway you are using. So, because you're likely to touch both sides of the runway, right, especially when you land. So it's the first one that you cross determines the runway use. So keep that in mind as we go through this, because you'll need to keep 1-8 and 3-6 clear. The current airport design allows takeoffs and landings entering the airport pattern from any and all available directions. And then just a heads up that the takeoff distance required is usually less than the landing rollout distance on the aircraft. So, first thing, the departure RPZ for runway 36 is unaffected. There is no impact. And I've used boxes to redact the zones because we always show this as a single picture. But if you read the circular, there is no runway safety area behind where you take off. So if I take off at the beginning of runway 36, I really have no impact by what's on the south RPZ. None. In fact, it's not even a factor for departure on 36. So then likewise, the next page, arrival on 1-8, there's no impact to this use either. The difference on this one, and I realize it's hard to see in PowerPoint, so I'll just highlight it, is you do have to have the 240 feet at the end of the runway on both sides when you are landing. Not when you're taking off, but when you're landing. However, here again, that 240 feet falls within my property, so it is agnostic to what is happening on the south end beyond that 240 feet. So this is a very salient point that I feel like keeps being missed. There are 2 uses on the CUP today that are unimpacted by this home. And I'm going to come back to that again, because I feel like as a land use authority, the land use laws as I understand it should maximize my ability to use. And I'm not asking for a change here, I'm simply saying there's a use that's unimpacted. We'll come back to it. Okay, departure on 1-8 then, this may be impacted. Seeing the new residents in the pictures. From what I saw, this use is impacted because now the ability to take off from the existing starting point would be impacted. Likewise, arrival on 3-6, keep in mind coming from either direction, would also be impacted. So where do we disagree? I just want to touch on this. It wasn't brought up, but because it was in the staff report, I wanted to address it. There keeps coming up the need for additional information about the plane's capabilities. The most demanding airplane was a Cessna 182. That's unchanged from our original application. The discussion about whether the plane is capable of landing in a configuration, we already agreed to that back in 2016. We already provided that information. Nothing in that CUP restrains the plane to only a Cessna 182, and in fact, the letter of intent was very clear. It was the most demanding, but not the only aircraft to be used here. In law, there's often a burden that you can't create your own substantial change in circumstances. So it seems very arbitrary and capricious for you to wake up one morning and decide, we approved that already, but I don't like it, so just kidding. I just bring that up because that's how it feels from the applicant side on the plane. And then the FAA circular is clear, and I want to bring this up because I think
And I think this is a very important point.
it gives you information. The circular makes clear that aircraft operations cannot be prevented, regulated, or controlled simply because the airport or runway does not meet the design standards for a particular aircraft type. And then for specific operational situations unique to the airport, you can contact or consult with the FAA Flight Standards Service. In an attempt to act in good faith and just give a little bit more, on the next page, I'm going to say that industry standards for verifying a requirement in the aerospace industry, there are 5 methods for verifying a requirement: analysis, test, inspection, demonstration, and similarity. The county makes the argument that they cannot complete the analysis a second time, but because they don't have information, and that if they did complete it, it's highly improbable that we would be able to land within the airport configuration. Helicopters don't fly when analyzed either. That's why there's 5 methods and not 1. So demonstration, as stated before, this plane has demonstrated to be capable of landing and taking off with current airport configuration on this property. And similarity, a similar plane, the Skywagon 180, which is the tailwheel version of a 182, was routinely used on this property prior to current owners. Again, because it didn't come up in your earlier discussion, I don't want to belabor, but in an attempt to just adjudicate questions that have been raised, that's what I provide on that particular subject. So, the circular is silent on how to amend the RPZs if the approach and departure surface is changed.
And the reason why that's important is your ordinance incorporates the circular, just so you follow it. And so we get into this circular analysis.
And then, well, normally staff in this body would be the adjudicated body for land use requirements. They're not for the circular requirements. And so where we have a conflict here in this Venn diagram is normally land use is the county, land use authority, that's this commission, and the airspace is the FAA. But in this case, the county has adopted an airspace use set of requirements that are owned by the FAA as part of the land use code. And so it becomes a gray area on who should interpret what. But I think it's been very clear that FAA is the interpretive body, the owning body of the FAA circular. And so that's where, because it's circular requirements, there's some trouble with silence and who can interpret. Airport traffic patterns, this is going to come into play. So I've provided here some information. Normally on an airport, you don't want to come straight in. Flying straight in is hard to judge, and so for most airports, you come in on a pattern. You enter that pattern on a 45, you fly downwind, you turn a base leg, and then you approach on final. And so you do 3 turns, and that allows you to look down the runway and make sure you don't have obstacles. It allows you to get a feel for how fast you're going in comparison. It allows you to put down flaps and take some other, do some other things that give you the right control, or to go around again if you anticipated incorrectly. A left-hand pattern is standard at most airports, although both are usually allowed. You do have some airports within the state that restrict to only one traffic pattern or one side. So for example, Salt Lake number 2 does not allow an east side pattern because you would get into trouble with traffic with Salt Lake International. And while a straight-in approach isn't prohibited, it definitely is not preferred. And then the circular is very silent in regards to traffic patterns and how a restricted traffic pattern might alter the requirements. The circular assumes configurations, all patterns are available. So that'll come into play here in a minute. You also have an approach and a departure surface. So the RPZ is on the ground to protect people and property on the ground. The approach surface is to protect the plane and the pilot, and you can modify those. You can see here in the circular, it's got examples where you have objects that may be a problem, and there are ways to deal with those. If you look at the requirements in the circular, a standard is that those zones overlap each other. The approach departure surface and the RPZ are in essence over top of each other. And when you go to...
Explain that, just make sure. The black, the area within the black bold is the...
approach departure.
And the pink highlighted area
is the RPZ. And the approach departure, if I might, comes off of the ground like this. So it comes off in an angle, and whereas the RPZ stays flat, the approach departure is how the airplane is going to climb, right, or descend. Thanks, Jeff. All right, so I have an opinion here, but the circular is silent. So my opinion is, if you change the traffic pattern, it would make sense that a portion of the RPZ would either disappear or be shifted because you have no planes flying and approaching in that direction. Likewise, it could shift, so I gave 2 indications. The circular is silent, but just from what you're trying to do, if you have no overhead plane coming in, you have no risk to people and property on the ground. And so if we were to restrict departure on 1-8 to a right turnout only, there is never a risk to the home because I never go left, right? The pilot can never turn left, therefore flying over the residence, if it was restricted to a right-hand only pattern. Likewise, landing on 3-6 would be a left-hand pattern, again, because it depends on the direction you're going, whether you turn right or left, depending on which way you're facing. So a left-hand pattern would avoid anything with the east side of the property, which is the southeast side is where this residence is built. Again, circular silent, so create some ambiguity. As I read a memo staff provided, the indication was that even though the approach and departure surface may be changed or altered due to the silence in the circular, that there was no adjustment to the RPZ. And I just, as an engineer who does safety analysis for rockets, this does not make sense to me. If there's nothing flying overhead, there is no risk to the ground. And if I change the trajectory of what's flying overhead, then my risk to the ground changes with that trajectory. And so, because it's silent in the circular, it creates that ambiguity, but just looking at it from a principle standpoint, I believe that RPZ should adjust when a non-standard approach pattern or departure pattern is put in place, be it by a restriction or other kind of agreement. All right, next part. The circular requires the use of the FAA to address non-standard situations, and their involvement is referenced in various places. So this circular, as stated, is 322 pages. It says right up front, do not just focus on the paragraph that's specific to a zone you're looking at, because requirements for any given zone threshold information is scattered throughout. And it is. If you've been watching the page references, they're anywhere from page 3 to page 322. And so there's information throughout that entire circular. And several times within there, rather than try and cover every situation, the circular simply says, coordinate with the FAA. And I'm gonna walk through what some of those are. But the first one is the memo on guidance for compatible land use, which I showed you earlier, the table, says we should coordinate with APP 400. The next one, it says we cannot limit. It's clear that solutions are preferred over making an airstrip obsolete. On the next one, interpreting requirements, you can interpret silence one of two ways. It can be it's not allowed unless specified, or not prohibited unless specified. And my understanding of the land use laws in our state is that it takes the position of land use is allowed unless prohibited, meaning if it's silent, there's an allowance. Chris expressed to me that he has a desire not to involve the FAA, and I believe that's arbitrary given the circular requirements. They are the authoritative source of the requirements. The county code requires the circular to be followed, and the circular requires the use of the FAA for these non-standard situations, or even simply for the fact that a home has been built and could be considered an incompatible land use. A few more bullets on using the FAA. I think I've covered that. A couple more things for you to consider out of the airport standard. So there is this paragraph on existing airports, and it makes very clear if the requirements of the circular cannot be met on an existing airport, the circular indicates the FAA should review what adjustments are needed to operational procedures necessary to accommodate operations to the maximum extent while maintaining an acceptable level of safety. And so there again, it's very clear. There's an order on that. There's a process for that. There's an adjudicative body the standard requires on that.
That's what the county ordinance requires by incorporating the circular.
Okay, this circular talks about displaced thresholds, and I want to talk for this a minute. If you look at the figure, this is almost entirely what our situation is. So clearly the FAA has dealt with this before. This is not a unique case. I find it interesting, and again, I read requirements and interpret them for a living. The fact that they have said it's an unacceptable incompatible land use implies that there are acceptable incompatible land uses. So within the figure, it gets into that. It needs to be adjudicated with the FAA per the circular. I want you to note that one of the reasons you could do a displaced test threshold is as a means for locating the RPZ to mitigate unacceptable incompatible land uses. And then when I reference that the zones behind you do not apply on takeoff, I've given you the reference highlighted there for that. In addition, this talks about the ability to place a threshold, which is a different place to take off, to minimize unacceptable incompatible land uses. And that'll come into play. Mr. Luthi asked me to go ahead, or asked through Joe, that I go ahead and present the options that I have raised with staff. And so that will come into play as we discuss options. Okay, within the circular, there's some guidance here, and it says while threshold displacement is often used as a solution for constrained airspace, airport designers need to carefully weigh the trade-offs of a displaced threshold. Threshold displacement should not be undertaken only after a full evaluation reveals that displacement is the best alternative. These standards minimize the loss of operational use of the established runway and reflect the FAA policy of maximum utilization. So here again, it asks us to go to the FAA and get that done. So in an effort to say, well, what would the FAA say? There are many airports that have homes in their defined RPZs. I believe it's very clear that the FAA has additional guidelines and procedures to deal with these circumstances and situations, but rather than make a 300-page document a 700-page document, they simply said, this is the baseline, and when you get into one of those cases that's the 20%, not the 80%, you call us, and we'll walk through that next set of more complicated requirements. The circular, which the county code requires to be met, does require the FAA to be involved if an airport cannot meet the circular requirements. And the circular allows the FAA to consider alternate means to ensure an acceptable level of safety. And then I want to note, an FAA expert may have additional options beyond what I present that I don't know about, but clearly they may.
Hey, Ms. Holyoke, I apologize for interrupting, but I just want to point out, you're doing a fantastic job, and there's only about 3 minutes left in the 30 that the commission wanted to set aside, so use your time accordingly, please.
I request additional time. I mean, we're doing it we're trying to educate you as
Sure.
fast as possible. And the revocation of a CUP that's been granted is the taking away of a property right. And where, I talked with the county attorney. Your staff has had primacy, which means they primed the pump by giving you their report, the 113 pages. And I think in fairness, we're trying to get through 53 pages of a presentation as fast as we can. So take that into consideration. I think we need about 10 to 15 more minutes.
Commissioners, what would you like to do in that regard?
I'm sorry, did you ask me?
No, commissioners,
Yeah,
sorry.
that's what I thought. I want to make sure that.
Yes, sir.
I think we're proceeding pretty well. I would be amenable to giving them some additional time on that. When we were originally faced with potential of 2 hours, that seemed unreasonable for a presentation, just to try to get that in. But I feel confident, and if it's 10 minutes, okay.
So without objection, commissioners, we'll let Ms. Holyoke continue the presentation, and we do have a statutory time frame according to our bylaws of 8 o'clock, and so we'll want to address that before the top of the hour. So just a reminder for everyone. Okay, please continue. Thanks.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. So this is Santa Monica. While it is not the Cache County land use, and I know that, and the requirements may be different, that circular applies to all airports that are federally funded, and this particular airport is. I just want you to know that it's reported there are approximately 270 homes within the RPZs of that airport, and that is used daily for multiple jet departures. So clearly the FAA has some other tools in their pocket to evaluate the safety and mitigate concerns. Likewise, I've just pulled a few examples. In Savannah, Hilton Head, this is an area where there is trains that run through the RPZ, also an incompatible land use. A little closer to home, we have the Driggs, Idaho Airport that has structures within the runway protection zones when the county or city there decided to extend the runway. And then at Addison Airport in Texas, there are structures and railway lines, including public transportation services, that are all within the RPZ. And so clearly the FAA has some other things that they can do in these non-standard situations. I want to go through the options that we brought forward and recommended staff consider. So the first one, I'm going to talk 1B first. As we started, I did not present 1B as its own option because I caveated the discussion with the fact that I felt like 2 of 4 uses were unaffected and should be maintained regardless. So at the time I had the discussion, I couched it with the fact that I would prefer to maintain all 4 uses, and so the options were related to the maintenance of all 4. For the purpose of this discussion with revocation on the table, I think you need to heavily consider the fact that 2 of 4 uses are unaffected, and whether we need to put a condition that restricts to the 2 uses and you revoke the 2 that are affected, or whether you uphold. Please do keep in mind there is a way to take off and land unaffected by this home, and using exactly the existing condition. No change, and I'll talk a little bit about why an amendment was not filed in a minute. So the option I did present to keep all 4 uses open is allow a right turn on runway 18 and a left-hand pattern on arrival for 36. If air traffic is not allowed to enter or depart to the east, this eliminates the chance to fly over the residence, and that should, in my opinion, either eliminate the east side of the RPZ or realign the RPZ based on that new approach restriction. Option number 2, which could meet the circular, is, again, those 2 uses would remain unchanged at the bottom. For takeoff of runway 18, because there is no RP or RSA behind you, we could begin at the north property line, go approximately 640 feet into the property, then take up 240 for the RSA, and then the 1,000-foot departure begins 200 feet after the departure threshold. And looking at the site plan submitted by the neighbors on the south, this RPZ would then end before their residence. And that meets the requirements. That is a displaced threshold because he would start one takeoff farther into the property than you would the other. And so you'd have a runway length that ends up being longer, air quotes, but you have a displaced threshold, which means you can't use a portion of it in a given direction. So we're back to that guidance on displaced threshold, where the FAA needs to be involved to make sure that's the safest option. But it does meet the circular. The question then comes, landing on runway 36 would have to be adjusted in a similar fashion. The trick with this one is when you're landing, you have to have the 240-foot RSA on both the beginning and the end of the runway. And so in that case, we would have to shorten the runway to approximately 400 feet for that direction and landing only. And again, that's what displaced thresholds do. And I'm sorry, it's just landing, not departure. And so that would then restrict further what aircraft can land in 400 feet. But it would meet the circular, and it would meet with the current allowed uses, as the 182 is not the only plane that's used. Option 3, and again, these are in loose order of preference because you can see they get more complex. We could angle the runway slightly so that the center line of the runway puts the RPZ clear of the residence. We've identified where that rotation point would be, and a small rotation and angle here would definitely change it and make it not an issue. We've had neighbors suggest that we could move it to the west. That would require us to do some land acquisition because there are requirements about how you have to own certain portions of the zone today. But that's not entirely unfeasible either to protect the land use for a given direction. Okay, a little bit on what's been happening behind the scenes. I do want to note that on December 1st, I did provide these same options. I didn't give them in a presentation like this that tried to educate. I did not quote circular requirements, but I did state these options were there. And so this is something that it's been a matter of educating and some discussion about the circular requirements to that end. I will also remind you of that December meeting. It was about 9:30 p.m. by the time our issue came up. And in an effort to not try and do an hour-long presentation, I agreed to simply work with staff. Then January 26th, you had requested a status before your February meeting. I did provide that. I did let staff know of my intent to file an application to amend. However, I wanted to meet to discuss because as you can see, there are some things that are not absolutely clear here, and I wanted to try and adjudicate with staff my perspective on the FAA circular. The county did reply that a pre-filing meeting is required, and they let me know how to do that. On February 1st, I reached out because I hadn't heard anything, and I want you to note that staff indicated, bullet number 2 under February 1st, that please note the proper place for the discussions you are requesting is with the Planning Commission. I responded that I believe it needed to happen with staff first, because oftentimes I've been to these, and I know that you rely heavily on what staff says. And I felt like educating staff on our position was important. That said, I feel like staff has summarized and missed some salient points, so I appreciate the opportunity to present to you today. A few other things. I'm not gonna go through every one of these bullets, but some back and forth on setting up that meeting. Then in the meeting, I wanna highlight just a couple things. We did discuss the options. Sorry, Joe, next page. I did request that the FAA be involved for the circular. At that time, I actually recommended you take a mitigatory action and restrict us to the right-hand departures and left-hand pattern while we worked through the options with the FAA, because that took an immediate mitigatory action towards the concern and allowed us to meet the circular. Staff felt that the information, even though it was silent, they were hesitant to use the FAA on some parts, and then they indicated that if there was ambiguity, it went in favor of the landowner. And then I asked specifically for next steps. Chris represented he needed time to review the information, and that he would discuss with the county attorney, and that he did not anticipate the need to file an amendment in order to add a condition to the existing CUP. So I left that meeting with the understanding that if option 1 was agreed upon, I would not need to file an amendment. So then February 18th, the memo comes out with his findings. He asked for additional information. That memo made clear that he had missed the point that 2 of 4 uses were unaffected, and I believe in your packet that memo is in there with my exact language, so I didn't repeat it. I did then respond with that information, and I asked some additional questions. And I have a slide here at the end for what my additional questions are, but I put the exact language in the email, just in case you want to cross-reference. The staff acknowledged receipt. The staff report was emailed out on a Saturday, and it didn't include any of the February 21st information, and it didn't answer my questions. So all through this, I've heard various stories about can the Planning and Zoning Commission add or amend conditions during a reconsideration review? And if not, why not? I want to make the argument that condition 8 is very clear that this is a reconsideration. And if you look at the dictionary definition, it says reconsider is to consider something again, especially for possible change of decision regarding it. And if I just take my own observation of how you proceed in your process, when you are considering a CUP, you absolutely can make a motion that adds, modifies, deletes, or changes a condition. And so I am concerned that it continues to be a sticking point that you cannot add a condition. In this case, 2 of 4 uses are unaffected, and a restrictive condition, even if we have to go through an adjudicative process with the FAA, at worst case, those 2 land uses that are unaffected, in my opinion, should remain. Approved and good. So is a CUP amendment required to simply add a condition to the existing CUP? I still don't know the answer on this. I've gotten a yes, I've gotten a no, I've gotten an I'll talk with the county attorney, and so I'm unsure. In addition, did the February 10th meeting with staff fulfill the pre-application meeting requirement? I don't know if it did or not. And then I asked, are there other examples within the county where a CUP has been revoked because one of several land uses was no longer compliant with the CUP conditions, even though the remaining uses on the same CUP were compliant? So, my conclusion. There is no decisive evidence that the Southern RPZ has an unacceptable incompatible land use because the circular requires the use of APP 400 once a residence is built there. Second, the FAA needs to be involved in analyzing the options and making a recommendation for what the best option is. And last, and this is very worst case, if the residence were to be an unacceptable, incompatible land use in the RPZ, 2 of 4 conditions and rights granted by the existing CUP are unaffected and in my opinion should be upheld and maintained.
Great job, Ms. Holyoke. Questions, commissioners, for Ms. Holyoke?
think she's done a really good job of explaining it, and it follows right along with a lot of airports I've been in and out of.
Could I ask just one clarification? So in the proposed changes, we talk about using, right-hand turns only. I don't remember exactly which one, but how does a pilot unfamiliar with that airport know that?
So that's a great question. If the FAA is the person restricting it, then within the airport map, it is very clear that that is the case. And it gives a procedure for every airport. In this case, when I talked with staff, they indicated that because it's a land use and not an FAA requirement, we would record the condition on the CUP. And then because this is not a public airport, you have to have our permission to land here. It is our responsibility today to explain the procedures for the airport, and this would simply be one we explained as well to anyone outside of ourselves using it, right? So if a friend comes, we simply say, you can come, but on departure, it's a right turn only, and your pattern has to be a left hand if you're landing in, and then we give the runways. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. I mean, my understanding of airports, even if it's private, I mean, it's kind of an open use. If somebody's having difficulty or whatever with their airplane, they can. But my question was, how do they know really what those rules are based around that? So thank you.
Yeah, and let me just add to that. In an emergency situation, everything goes.
Yeah.
So in an emergency, the FAA will back. All procedures do not have to be followed. You do what you do to get safely to the ground. That said, pilots take an oath that they'll risk their own life and kill themselves before hurt someone on the ground intentionally or with negligence in where they choose to land. So.
And unfortunately, that's been the case down at the Ogden Airport where I-15's been used on several occasions.
Any other questions for me?
Commissioners?
Thank you for your time.
Yep, thank you. Okay, Commissioner, so it's just a minute or two before 8, and I know that you want to hear from others if they're interested in speaking on this item, and then we also have a couple of other items on the agenda. Chris or other staff in the room, what sort of time frame are you looking at for the other items?
Let's see, I remember we have the discussion for.
Yeah, number 4 is a discussion on the recreation facility.
That should be short.
Okay,
Tim, that should be a short discussion, number 4.
okay.
General plan update should also be 15.
Sure.
We can make that fit.
I can do what I need to do.
15, 20 minutes. Somewhere there.
Recommendation of 30 minutes?
I think,
Is that sufficient?
does that sound okay?
Start
I mean, it may not be sufficient, but.
May not be.
15 is 30, we got 2 other people addressing us, and we gotta talk for a minute. So I think we better go. Hold on,
We can always extend.
go to quarter 2.
That's fine with me. Make a recommendation that we extend 45 minutes.
Second motion.
Okay, we have a motion and a second to extend the meeting for another 45 minutes. Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. All right, Commissioners, assuming the next thing we would like to find out, would you folks like to give comments this evening? Absolutely. Come on up. You just need a couple minutes? Is that what you're thinking, or? Okay. No problem. It's not a requirement, but what is required is that you state your name.
Okay, my name is Brittany Rupert. Me and my husband are the south landowners. And I just wanted to, first of all, I thought it was the airplane, the homes in the runway protection zone side. I'd like to point out that those were public use airports, not a private use airport. And then also, Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, but the precedence has been set to remove homes from the RPZ as for the north home that was adjusted to get the north home out of the RPZ. So that precedence was already kind of set there. And then I just wanted to, there was a lot of talk about why it would be okay to amend it, but I just wanted to point out that it was still stated that, you would need to be reapplied for an application to change it, so I just wanted to put that out for the public. So, that's it.
Thank you, Ms. Rupert. Anyone else like to comment? Come on, make your way over here if you'd like.
My name's Dirk Howard. Just my couple of points are that the FAA circular does state that the applicant should have doesn't require them to have an interest in the land underneath the runway protection zones, but they highly recommend it to avoid conflicts over ground use. I also want to point out that there is now a home in the runway protection zone, which is triggering the reconsideration. And in my time of living next door to the airport since 2016, I have never observed a fixed-wing aircraft to land there. So those are my points.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am. Come on up, please.
My name is Laura Barris, and I don't have a presentation either, but I just feel like maybe the information that was presented might have just muddied, the simple fact that there is a single dwelling right in the middle of the runway protection zone. And I think that, not knowing all the FAA regulations, but that it seems to me a private airstrip that hasn't been used for, apparently, 4, 5, 6 years. That maybe that needs to be considered differently than a commercial airport. And in the fact that so much information was provided, I would just ask that maybe the staff's findings could be just briefly restated so that, the reason for the revocation can be reminded to the board. And that's all.
Thank you. Okay, anyone else like to comment? Okay, seeing none. Commissioners, what would you like to do?
Chair, can I make a point?
Yes, sir.
If you follow back on the county's 2016, you follow down those pages and you come to page, let's get to page 11 of 113. In this is where it's talking about what's going to go in there, and there's an advisory circular that's talking there. It is left to the Planning Commission to determine whether to require the applicant own the land associated with the RPZs or to allow the airport with condition that the development rights of these parcels have priority over the airport, and future developments in these areas may restrict the airport's ability to operate. So just a point I was reading over there, and that came out in the 2016 during the talk of what's going on in the airport.
Was that a condition?
It's just advised as an advisory circular on, Chris, do you know where I'm at here?
I'm pulling that up.
Yeah, page 11.
Page 11 of the 2016.
I'm just gonna plug this in so we can see what we're looking at.
Attachment 1.
But that wasn't Attachment 1, you said?
Yeah, go down, keep going a little bit. Right, this next page, I believe. Right there.
Paragraph starts with advisory circular, but it's in the middle.
Try and The decision at the time, there were some different commissioners here. The decision at the time was not to require that they own the land, but that it allow the runway protection zone to exist with that condition as stated.
We could also, on that same text, go down to page 30, 31. Which is the record.
Are you referring to the 31 you said?
Yeah, 31 was fine, but it's, there was a condition 8 that was added to the conditions that basically stated that if any development occurred within the protection zone, and there's comments taken in context, page 30 or page 31, from applicant, staff, and legal counsel agreeing that if any structures was built within the runway areas and zones, the Holyoke Airport conditional use permit must be reconsidered by the Cache County Land Use Authority.
Yeah, I think that's on.
It's part of county responses to the assertions. Yeah.
So it's just really saying that we need to reconsider, and that's what we're doing, right?
That is what we're doing, correct.
Well, I would, the explanation of Rachel is, and the FAA requirements, if the county, as I look at this, if the county says we're gonna use the FAA circular, then, yeah, you've gotta use their recommendations in a variety of ways. And there's airports all over the United States, especially little ones, that have left turn only, approaches or departures. I mean, that's not uncommon at all. And obviously airports that, you know, their land use deals have changed to where they've got houses right off the end of the runway, but that's not uncommon at all. And I don't see that given that information, that option number 2, which was both runways with the adjustment of approaches, is certainly adequate.
I guess the point I would make on this is we've been given a lot of information tonight, significant amount of information, and Ms. Holyoke's done a great job of summarizing that in a short amount of time. That is something to digest. The one thing that really stood out to me in that is that there's a process that the FAA outlines to deal with this, and where we've incorporated the circular in there, it outlines that process. That's the concern I have looking at this is have we used what we've incorporated into the conditional use permit by looking at that circular. That's the concern I have going into a decision on revocation.
So are you saying then that you're leaning towards, what are you saying? Are you saying that you're leaning towards continuing with revocation?
What I'm looking at is, well, for both of those things, we've been given a ton of information, so I would be remiss to take an action tonight with, this volume of information that we just received. And so, I mean, my guidance would probably be to continue this to a future date, but also along with that, if there's a process for dealing with something exactly like we're talking about, the structure built within this zone, that is called out by the FAA in the circular that we cite, to me, that's probably what needs to be exhausted to start with prior to a revocation.
And I would say that's the question should be asked, as if it does.
And I think that's
step as staff.
And I will take that amendment to that, because it places some doubt there, and I think council needs to advise on that. But my feeling is that we should continue this for up to 90 days to allow us to take that under advisement.
Brady, what are your thoughts?
Well, I guess the thing, I really appreciated the preparation and information provided tonight. The thing I'm trying to put together in my mind is at what point, because as with every county ordinance, just as we experienced tonight with the land slope, if there's a county ordinance, even though we feel inclined to let it slide on that deal, we can't. So my confusion is, I know this was new to the county when this all was put together, but at what point does county ordinance, even though we involved the circular in some of our decision, where does the county ordinance trump the county ordinance, and where does the circular change it? That's my question.
Good question.
That's my confusion at this point.
So does that have to be an FAA question to the FAA? So
That's what I think you should ask staff to review, and we're happy to review it. My initial take, I won't share because I don't want to lengthen this conversation, because I think it would precipitate a response from the proponent. I think I think the best course of action is to allow staff to consider the points that were made. Staff, I will say, in whole does not agree in a great measure, especially the way staff was represented in their discussion. I don't agree with that. I think that was misrepresented or misunderstood or miscommunicated. And I'm happy to present how that might have been different than what was communicated tonight. I think that's quite different than what was presented. And so I would appreciate as staff the opportunity to consider what was said, same as commission is considering, and to give specific response to some of the points that were raised. That gives them also the response to, or the opportunity to respond in kind with written and clearly stated an opportunity to clearly state their point. So we're talking about the same type of thing and not across from each other, but working towards the same resolution. I would appreciate that same opportunity that they would appreciate.
Okay, thanks, Brady.
Can I make just one observation?
Hang on just a second, if you don't mind, Mr. Chambers. Let me circle back to you, okay? Brandon, what are your thoughts?
I'm just trying to get my head around, our legal reps and, about the change of things. How do we amend these?
Right.
Is it possible? Well,
right.
We just learned that it's, from what I understood, maybe I'm wrong, it isn't possible to amend this.
Right.
So we have the conditions that were set in the CUP originally, and we have to follow those conditions that are met by that original CUP. How do we amend them? Okay. Apart from what we're reading, she did a great job. I learned a lot. I mean, what she presented tonight was awesome. Nice job. Yeah. I'm just going, I see her point. There are purposes that can be, fulfilled through the circular, but going back to the CUP and the conditions that are there, can we amend those?
Yes, right. And maybe some of that is also something that staff can respond to and council can respond to as well. Ms. Lee.
Okay, so like the ordinances can be fluid. We make amendments to those, and at any point that, when you apply, that's the ordinance that applies. But as we said, that this goes with the FAA circular, does that mean as this changes, then our conditional use changes? I don't know.
I think that's also a good question.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think as one of the commissioners, I think there may be a couple of us who were here at the time this came through. I think at that time, I know speaking for myself, I felt like on the record, we made it clear what our understanding was, which was if there's a structure constructed in the RPZ, this CUP will need to be revoked. And I think the minutes account for that. And so that's our understanding. I think also the ordinance says may revoke. It doesn't say you have to revoke, right? So there's definitely some discretion there. And, you know, council has told us that this is not the appropriate venue to make a change, even though we all may feel comfortable that, hey, a tweak in this can work. We're also being told that this is not the format to do that in. So I think we do have a number of questions. It does make sense maybe to consider a continuation and allow staff to respond to the presentation and the information that was given tonight, as well as some of the other items that commissioners have brought up. And then staff can make those points, provide them to the proponent, give you sufficient time to review and also prepare rebuttals to those points and bring those back to the commission. Is that kind of what I'm hearing folks might be interested in doing? Yes.
Yeah, it sounds like we need to get, more of that information on how the FAA circular applies.
Would someone like to make a motion to? Go ahead, Brandon, sorry.
I'd like to make a motion to continue the action at hand for up to 90 days.
Yeah. I think that's pretty standard, so I like that.
I second the motion.
Okay, we have a motion and a second to continue the Holyoke Airport CUP relocation item on the agenda for up to 90 days to allow staff and proponents to respond to some of the questions that have been made.
Chris, you're still connected to.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So, so we have a motion and a second.
Question.
Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Mr. Chambers, I'm sorry I didn't circle back to you before that, but was there something you'd like to add?
Yeah,
But if you would, come up to the mic, so our minute taker can.
Yeah, so, you know, this whole process is unique, because you are what's called an administrative body. The county council is a legislative body. And yet, in the process of determining the revocation or not the revocation, you become a judicious body somewhat. And you're not really well suited for that. In the court system, there's evidence that's brought in and it's tested, and you're not at that level, you're not required. Council and I have talked about that. But I am concerned that in a judicial or a quasi-judicial function, because I've been a Board of Appeals chairman, and that is a quasi-judicial function, that the prosecutor doesn't really have open contact with the judge or the adjudicator on this. And that's just from a purely esoteric position, that if you're gonna consult with the prosecutor on this, I think we're entitled to know, and I would caution against having ex parte contacts, because you're really operating in a quasi-judicial function. The second point, I'll be very, very quick. If you haven't picked up on it, we're problem solvers. We're really trying to solve problems. And I went out of my way to have a conversation with John Luthi and Taylor yesterday to discuss things so that we wouldn't. And if there are solutions to this, openly. And I'm a little bit chagrined that you make that decision and announce that you can't make a modification when the word reconsider is very clear in the dictionary what it means, without giving us some notice that you're going to do that, because we would have applied for an amendment to this prior to this if we were told that it couldn't be reconsidered here. And we've gotten mixed signals on that back and forth. But I want to solve problems. I don't want to create problems for you. I really do want to solve, and so does so do the Holyokes. I just make that.
Thank
you.
you.
I appreciate your time.
You bet.
I know you spend a lot of time on this public service, and you don't get enough kudos. And I appreciate your time.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chambers. Thank you, Ms. Holyoke. Okay, let's see, next item on our agenda, Commissioners, is item number 4, discussion on 4100 recreational facility related use definitions.
Good evening. Our goal this evening was to present to you a Cache County Development Services initiated text amendment proposal, application to amend the code, and that would be specifically the use-related 2 options. And I would say that we're not limited to these 2 options, but this is at least a starting point, and we would like your feedback this evening. And I would add that this is in light of inquiries that we've been starting to receive since the approval of the Hollow Ridge RV campground in Smithfield, or adjacent to Smithfield. Additional inquiries about, hey, we're interested in exploring property for an RV campground, and our sense was that it would be wise to submit an application for an amendment, which effectively would put a hold on additional applications, that the pending doctrine ordinance would apply as this ordinance is under review. This is not something that we just sit on. We need to take action and conduct research and make progress in order for this to, the pending doctrine ordinance, pending ordinance doctrine to apply. With that being said, as you see in the packet, the application on the brief proposal suggests either to amend
Are you gonna amend that Beaver Mountain snowpack?
I'm sorry, I missed that. Oh, yeah, that's my,
We'd appreciate if you could.
You going somewhere tomorrow?
yeah, I didn't have the proper slide up to begin, didn't I? Yeah. So here we go. So a couple of options, and just here for your reference is the definition of campground, or excuse me, a recreation facility. So one option is to amend this definition to remove or make it clear that a campground is not allowed as a recreation facility. And that's probably a lesser time commitment to study, because let's face it, it'd be quite a process to study where campgrounds are most appropriate and what setting and what type of zone and what type of surrounding land uses and the like. The limitations, the conditions and so forth would take time. But to otherwise just remove it as an option in recreation facility is one option, and it could be a temporary option, and then revisited later with a more thorough analysis of where and when should they be allowed and what conditions or limitations. The second option that's been spelled out here is that just in the use table, schedule of uses, 1709030, which I'm not bringing up on the monitor, but that it changed from conditionally allowed to not allowed or prohibited in the A10 zone district. Now, if it was only applied to the A10 zone district, it means that it could be applied for in the FR40 zone. And I just would like to show a map. And you may see Beaver Mountain on this map. Let's see. There we go. I tried to differentiate.
Would you mind just pulling that mic a little closer to your mouth? I'm really having a hard time hearing you and understanding you.
Here we go.
Can you pull it even closer?
I'll attempt to, yes. So what you're looking at here is the lighter color in the valley is the A10 zone. And as the ordinance currently reads, is anywhere in that light zone in the A10, someone could pursue a conditional use for an RV campground or recreational use. The publicly owned lands are the solid green colors kind of a lighter green and a darker green. And then the more transparent green color is the FR40. And you'll note that there are some FR40 zones that lie between public lands and a community, albeit with some A10 property between, say, Mendon and publicly owned lands. There are some FR40 areas, which would suggest that RVs might travel through a community to access FR40 property, say at a mountain bench that is accessed through a community. That condition could be in some of these other communities on the East Bench. And whether it be Richmond area, there's a little more FR40 zone property. So, and then a bunch of FR40 zone property where there may be less direct road access. So this is just part of what needs to go into the analysis is, should there be just a temporary restriction of RV campgrounds in all zones, or should it just be removed from A10 as a phase one, and then maybe there's a phase two to analyze whether it be an overlay zone, or we don't know exactly what this needs to be, but we wanted to get it started, get some feedback, some thoughts from you, and then get to work with some regular check-ins and work done to bring to you. Chris, anything to add?
No, I really think a lot of it stems from that last process we went through. There was a lot of opposition, and I think just some questions raised by the commission and even the council members who were called because of concern as to why this would be an appropriate use adjacent to homes. And this is just an opportunity to explore that and see if there can be amendments made that make sense, that whatever they look like. I don't think we have an idea in mind of what that is, if it's to fully restrict it or to set up a buffer, or to, there's probably lots of ways to look at that. But that's the only thing else I would add, is that it's just become apparent that might create additional conflicts in the future.
Chris, I might just also add that another option that could be explored, either as a phase one or a phase two, is maybe a limited A10 application as appropriate as an ag tourism use, that maybe a RV campsite or two is appropriate as a accessory function to agriculture, and it's low impact, and it's kind of remote and isolated, and I think there are a variety of websites that those types of things can be marketed.
Well, just real quick, one thing, as I think back on it, and I know we could do nothing to change what's behind us because it was the law, but it don't make no sense to me that we can have an A10 where you're allowed one residence, one family. You can apply for a CUP, RU5 or RU2, but then I don't even remember the acreage, if they're, what was the acreage? But they were talking like 66 sites.
Well, it'll be an A10, so 10 acres you could have.
Yeah, but how many total acres was there? Was there 20?
30?
Just over.
About 30 acres. I can't remember.
I think it was 22,
you guys
my
got
recollection.
We'd have let them put 2 houses there with no problem. We'd have let them put 4 if they'd have come in and talked to us, maximum of 10. But then we tell them they can let 66 different families, individuals, whatever else, habitate on that land.
That's
So
the same thing.
That's sort of the
Any
concern.
conditional
The
use.
intensity of the use is where the concern is, right?
I think in large measure, I would say there might be additional concerns on top of that from what we've heard.
But one more quick thing on that I was also thinking of, so dog kennels, so we limit, you can only have 13 dogs on a parcel, well, or whatever them numbers are. We haven't saw that fortunately for a little bit. But I don't know if we need to start, I appreciate you guys bringing this to us, but I don't know if we need to say you can have a maximum of 10 campers on a certain area, or,
Right.
the way we've done with dogs, because there's a whole lot of stuff we require now for a dog kennel, but yet again, prior to this, the camping is.
Yeah. I think that was Tim's last point was, if we do say it can be appropriate in the A10 zone, but do we need to put some parameters on it? Yeah.
Right.
I feel that, I've I've been wrong before, but I feel that this may be kind of a knee-jerk reaction to an individual event that happened. You know, as we talked about this, the different uses in zones and went through, we had a pretty robust discussion about campgrounds, and the commission felt that this was an appropriate use. And you know, I think the risk that we run is that anytime people get together, 100 people, and come and yell at us, yeah, then we're gonna remove a use from the whatever zone, and I think that's a really bad precedent for us to start. Do we need to relook at this and maybe put some controls around it? Yeah, I think so, but I think pulling that out as a use, I don't. It goes back to the road thing that we did. You know, we do a resolution that, you know, we're just going to kick it down the road a little bit. I think the thing that would make us get this handled quicker is if it stays in the code as it is, and we put that up on the agenda.
Put what?
That we review this and come up with language in there on a campground, or whatever it is, you know, recreational use. We work on that definition, and we can, you know, whether it's number of spaces or whatever it may be. Yeah. You know, as we do this in Vision Cache, we're looking at preserving open space and recreation and all of the different things that most people agree on, and I think we have to look at what's a compatible use there. If somebody's out in an area and they recreate, I was thinking about this as a lot of people that had complaints about this proposal there probably have a camper in their garage or some storage unit that they don't like either. and they go out and they use these RVs, they use these campers in various places, but because it was in their backyard, it's a big issue. So I don't know. I saw this on there and I thought, no, I don't think that's the direction we need to go. I think we need to deal with it, but just making an knee-jerk, hey, we need to yank this out. I don't think that's the way to go. That's my opinion.
But what you're proposing is that we put this under review, and then it kind of puts it out there that we're not just going to approve them like the last one. And we're going to start talking about it more and putting, because I can think of some areas in the valley, the middle part of the valley, where maybe an RV park would be pretty, make a lot of sense.
And along with that, you know,
our recreation, or Bud Phelps bird refuge down there, that'd be a great place for an RV park
or something like that.
We don't have sufficient. I mean, if you try to get a campground at Logan Canyon, you have to go a year ahead.
Right.
To get a campsite up. There is a need for this type of a facility. Does it need to be controlled in a reasonable fashion? Absolutely. But I think we're kind of sticking our head in the sand saying that we can just take it out of there. Let's throw it on the FR40. We know that's really difficult to make happen. Here's the other thing, council can correct me on this, but in our training that we had, you were at that, and we talked about if we have proposed changes in there, then as long as we've noticed those, then we're able to go with that. So if we did have applications come in, the thing is that we've got to get going on this and get those proposed changes out there.
Is this considered getting going on it?
Yes.
Have we already begun that process?
It's a discussion
So
item.
if an application came in now, it would be on hold until we made a
Not
decision?
necessarily on hold, but it could be.
There's like a 6-month window. It's not a moratorium, but the state statute allows a certain window for acting on those things so that we're not just holding people up in perpetuity. But we, as staff, submitted an application to formally amend the code to make it a formal action for a discussion point. So it sets a point.
So that starts the clock, right?
Yep. Yes, it does.
So
And
staff
then-
starts
and
the
then
clock, yeah.
Then an
Yeah.
application that comes in during that time, they're on notice that they will most likely need to come into compliance with
Whatever.
the amended code.
You might decide it looks fine, we can leave it.
Exactly.
Chair,
I just think, go ahead.
That's, yeah.
I agree what's been said, but if you sit on the council side and our names are out there because we're elected,
And phone numbers.
and phone numbers, and address, and everything, there is,
Social Security
there is nothing more that brings contention to citizens than a CUP. Nothing more.
And I agree.
And I agree that there are places where that is good, but the point is in the application of the CUP, there is language that talks about, am I changing the ambience of the neighborhood? And that is up for a deference of opinions like crazy. I mean, you talk about campers, we talk about what happened in Petersboro with the straw maze, we talk about what happened with petting zoo in Wellsville and everything else.
Kennels.
We just need to think this through and get some input because
Airports.
airports, I have got so many people that say airports should be limited in different zones. And yet I know that there are people who say there's good reason for them to be in different zones. So we just need to talk about them because it's almost like we're saying to the public, come listen, but we're not going to listen. And so I just want some discussion, and I think the council does too, that we're hearing from the public that CUPs are a frickin' heartache, and they don't understand. If we can educate the people, but I mean, holy cow, talk about getting pulled out on the rug and addressed differently. You put a CUP out somewhere else, and that's what happens. So, and you're right, but it comes down to when we talk about an RV park or whatever else, I always look and think about the property rights. Am I using my property rights at the expense of the person who's next to me who has property rights also?
Every time.
Who has, yeah.
Every
So-
time you use your property.
But
Whatever you do.
these two other individuals here they sit, they build a house, you know, and they got property rights just like Mr. Chambers talked about the Holyokes have property rights. So there becomes that point where we align them, and I would like to see that the public is either educated or because I have talked about this since I've been elected. I hate flipping CUPs.
Yeah.
Well, good
So-
luck educating the
And I think
public.
that's the discussion. You know, if we're gonna have, the discussion should be, should we have CUPs? If we are, then they need to be regulated. They need to be in a reasonable fashion. And I don't know how you foresee every potentiality that's
You
out
don't?
there.
That's why we're asking
The
for
other
discussion.
option, I mean, if we get rid of CUPs, then we're gonna have rezone requests every month to have commercial rezones everywhere in the county, and then what do we get?
But at least you get the public input on that.
We do. But
And we have the discretion.
Yes.
It's a challenge.
Whereas with the CUP, it almost feels like you have a gun to your head.
It's an
Exactly.
allowed,
That's
it's
the
an
challenge.
I
allowed,
agree.
You gotta-
CUPs
you gotta
are
have a
allowed
darn
uses.
good reason to
If you can only,
say no.
if you can only say yes, and we've
With
had some bad
conditions.
experience before, if we say no, we get sued,
Yeah.
we go to court, we lose. That's most recent, and that one's not a good example, so I wouldn't just hang my head on that
Yeah.
one, it's not a good example,
Which one's not?
for lots of reasons. Kennel.
Kennel.
Yeah, the dog.
Yeah,
Cash
I just,
So if it's always just a yes, then of course there's always gonna be a problem. It's like a parent that always says yes. That kid is gonna be ruined from the get-go, right? He's just done.
Unless you're the kid, then it's a perfect deal.
It's just garbage. No, I
Until he
shouldn't say
turns
that.
25 and moves
So
out.
if we can find the balance of where we can say no, I think that's the balance.
Yeah.
And maybe we can impose conditions, but when we say the word mitigate, people interpret that to mean it goes away, and that's not what it means. It means it's been reduced in a reasonable fashion. And if that's what we're doing and people interpret it the wrong way, I know it's rude to say it, but that's on them. If they don't pay attention to process, they don't pay attention to the law, if they drive their car because they can and they don't care what the rules are, they're gonna pay the penalty for it. That's the same with any land use. If you don't pay attention to the law, it tends to bite you at some point. So I feel like there's a balance to be struck. It's not just dump it all on them, they should pay attention to the rules. We need to be a better acting and aware type of body of, if there really is an issue, how do we create the balance that addresses the issue when it's not a public hearing, it's a public meeting? You can come, but we don't have to listen to you. That just rubs everybody the wrong way from the get-go. So I really would be curious in having this discussion more with the attorney's office also and saying, how can we finally craft this line to say where we can deny? The state code specifies that, but there's some current recent case law that adds some more to that can help substantiate where you can draw that line of, you know what, that's not sufficient mitigation. It's not reasonable.
That would be nice.
Well, even the reindeer deal, you know, so you think, well, there's a rural spot, but due to the location, proximity to a couple of homes, boy, that made a ruckus, and still is.
That's a whole other issue that we need to delve into at some point, which is agritourism. So that has its own little ball of fun attached to it. That whole thing needs to be rewritten. It's not broad enough in its scope. And so I really appreciate what Jason's saying. We need to be cautious. We're responding to something based on one instance. It's problematic. That agritourism code was written based on one instance and one request with some feedback. We even had more feedback on that from a few different folks, but it was based primarily on one instance. And we find those break pretty quick. Code breaks, it just breaks. But we can do better. I think we can do better with figuring out how those things work. So this kind of discussion is very encouraging to me. I don't like it because it's a lot of work on our end to sort all that stuff out. And on your end, it's not just staff that has to carry that, but it's also you. And then the council in the end. Because they're stuck holding the bag with, if something goes wrong, they made the decision.
They get the phone calls.
They get the phone calls.
That's why.
Whether they can do anything or not.
That's why we're on the planning commission.
Big bucks.
I'm the lowest paid guy in the state, man.
Those ripple effects are so considerable. If we can find those balancing points, that's such a big deal if we can, wherever they are. And they tend to move. They do move. They always move.
I think everything's evolving.
I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. It's just like, we'd like a discussion because, just like Brady said, I mean, we sit here and we talk about density, and then all of a sudden a conditional use permit comes in and density flies right out the window, and the poor people who were sitting next to there like, what the flip happened to my property rights?
Mr. Chair, just noting the time.
Oh, I know.
I'd highly recommend that Lauren's been here, you give her 10 minutes at least.
Yeah, we'll do it. Let me just, real quick, my 2 cents are that, you know, a campground is a legitimate use in the valley, and we should provide places for that use to take place. There's a demand, there's a need, frankly, and so we should keep that in mind. And then, as Chris mentioned, we need a motion to extend the meeting to 9.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor to extend the meeting till 9?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed?
That Rex Peterson was pretty good.
Come on up, Lauren.
17 minutes out.
Thanks, Tim.
We'll talk more.
You're welcome.
And just, as much as we may hate conditional use permits, I still look at the alternative. If a farmer's out there and he's got a piece of property and he can put a kennel on it, or he can do whatever the conditional use is, and be able to maintain that open space, that accomplishes our goals that we constantly highlight. We like open space, we like ag, we like all of those things, versus if we eliminate those conditional uses or make them so onerous that they can't get those, then it's gonna be an RU2.
You're right.
And that's why I would fight
I'll give you
for things I hate.
the air guns. Are you guys awake still? Do we need to get up and stretch, do something? I'll start this by saying I did just get my notification that said start winding down for bedtime. So you'll get a more exciting Lauren than normally crashing for bedtime. So thanks everyone for extending the meeting until 9 p.m. for this, because this is an important topic. So for the record, I'm Lauren Ryan, and I'm the countywide planner with Cache County, and also serve as the project manager for the Imagine Cache update. And so I'm here this evening to give the Planning Commission An overview of the Imagine Cash process, what we've completed as a team so far, the importance of this process, and where we're headed to next. And so, we're starting with a fun graphic about Fat Boy ice cream. And look, this is what you waited for.
Yeah?
Oh, wow.
See, this hopefully is worth it for...
It's applicable to,
But this is why you all held out until almost 9 p.m. So please,
You better have more.
What's your thoughts under or talk, there's it in the agenda, your notes?
my notes.
Like
Oh.
the presentation, you mean?
Yeah.
I don't know if it is. I apologize if it's not. Yeah. And yeah, listen while you eat your ice cream. So why is Chris passing out ice cream, and why do we have the Fat Boy ice cream reference? Well, Tim and Chris helped me come up with this awesome graphic just to show what it takes from start to finish in a planning process, and how we as planners and staff start. Maybe let's think of the cows as the public. Well, that's terrible. I probably shouldn't have said that. But you've got all of these people. These,
Nobody else there.
yeah. Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. So we have all of these visions.
Some might say sheep would be a better metaphor.
Okay.
But
But in the ice cream, gotta have
I'm not
the
gonna try to get too deep into connection.
So we have all these visions and ideas and principles and asks of the community, and how do we distill that down into a final product like delicious ice cream that you're eating right now, that's something that is implementable and can be used by the county, by the commission, by the council as a planned product that the public has backing behind and feels good about, and then actually has implementation. I've heard a lot tonight, we're struggling with our zoning right now, and this process will hopefully really help to give the commission and council some direction with how to handle these issues that come up. And so from the unincorporated county has seen an increase in growth and continues to see growth. And so with that increasing populations and the changes in the municipal boundaries and growth, it's created a challenge to land use planning and how the county collaborates at a regional level. So the county comprehensive plan was last adopted in 1998 and has seen little implementation due to lack of actionable direction from that plan. And so this Imagine Cash process started with the need to rewrite the county general plan while also producing actionable and implementable strategies. And so here I wanted to display that we are going through 4 different planning processes right now. And if you think about them almost like a wheel, all 4, they have their separate processes and intent, but they all work together as one. And so currently, we're in the process of the general plan, the regional collaboration plan, urban and rural area assessment, and cost of services. You'll hear the urban and rural area assessment and cost of services sometimes tied together as one, but they are 2 separate plans and processes. And so the general plan works to address policies, goals, and strategies of the county, while the regional collaboration plan adapts and applies information from the general plan to address collaboration and communication across all jurisdictions, while the urban and rural area assessment and cost of services plan serve as technical documents to support the general plan and regional collaboration plan. So just to dive in a little bit further into each of those plans, so the general plan is required by Utah State Code and addresses policies, goals, and strategies to achieve the community's vision. And once again, that last update was done in 1998, and little to no, we don't really use that a lot as a reference tool. And so the general plan will be used as a guiding tool for future implementation strategies in the form of potential zoning code updates and other tools, and hopes to achieve actionable strategies and policies so that the plan will be utilized, unlike what we've seen with the last comprehensive plan update. And the intent of the regional collaboration plan is to adapt and apply the information from the general plan, urban and rural area assessment, and cost of services to a regional focus for strategies, growth, and service across all jurisdictions in the county. This will help to establish a regional communication plan and implementation process, and will really set a precedent for how the county will collaborate on a regional level. And so I just wanted to show, you see a map here of the entire county and the municipal boundaries. And just, we have a large area that we cover. And so this plan really is going to set a precedent and hopefully lead the county as being a leader to have these regional discussions on issues that affect the entire county. And then the urban and rural area assessment and cost of services. The urban and rural area assessment, like I said, they're the technical documents that support both the regional collaboration plan and the general plan. The urban and rural area assessment will specifically identify existing and future growth patterns with a focus on essential services, fire, EMS, sheriff, water, sewer, and roads. And then the cost of services will identify the costs associated with those services and potential revenue and funding sources. And along with that, they'll establish various potential growth patterns and the associated costs with those growth patterns as well. So that covers the basis for those 4 plan elements and how they all feed into this Imagine Cash process. These guiding principles that you see in front of you will help to guide the framework of the general plan. These principles have been developed with feedback from the public in what they view as important and have further been refined by us as staff and our consultants that we're working with. And they will be the basis for the policies that were brought forward as a survey to the public. I'll go into that in a little bit more detail in a couple more slides. And so you can read here, our guiding principles are active lifestyles and recreation, heritage and stewardship, economic vitality, regional collaboration, and valley connectivity and transportation. And so that brings us to what have we heard from the public so far, and what strategies have we used to take this information to the public. So to help establish the vision, we had interviewed 33 stakeholders throughout Cache County regarding goals, challenges, and opportunities and values in the county. Various open houses were held throughout the county, and I will emphasize too, if we go back to our graphic of the smooth transition of cow to completed ice cream, we also had a pandemic in the middle of all this that we've had to deal with. We've had staffing changes. I was not the original planning, I didn't start this process, my predecessor did, so we've gone through a lot of turmoil, and it hasn't been a smooth ice cream process from start to finish, but we're here now. And so we did the best we could with these outreach events. So we held open houses. We had a booth at the fairgrounds, and information was gathered through the form of questionnaires, surveys, interactive mapping, and then we had this cool idea wall that people could just text in a number of their ideas, which was kind of a cool tool to use during the pandemic. And we also had this video competition where we asked Cache County residents to say what they love about Cache County, which was kind of a cool thing to do and got people involved. This was the winning video. I won't play through it since we're short on time. And then the next form of public outreach was taking what we heard from that visioning phase to inform draft policies and implementation strategies to achieve the general plan, mission, and vision. We held a public open house with a presentation on the process and also stakeholder focus group workshops that some of our consultant leads held along with staff. And those focus group workshops were based on those guiding principles. And then finally, we took the policies and implementation strategies along with a draft future land use map you see on the right-hand side here to the public for online surveying. We sent postcards to unincorporated county residents that owned parcels over 5 acres. We had multiple news articles, one in particular, an op-ed that was written that really got a lot of people involved and wanting to take the survey, social media posts, and through this we heard from over 1,000 community members, which it's been difficult for engagement through the pandemic, but this really, I think, ramped up, and we heard a lot of good feedback through this process. on the bottom there, you can kind of see our visitation to our website and see the big bump when the op-ed article came out. So thanks to the gentleman who wrote that op-ed article. And once again, the future land use map you see on the right there, we had public comment on as well. And so we produced a number of documents that summarize each of these public outreach events. And I did provide these in the shared Google Drive folder. You should see a folder that says draft general plan documents, I think, if I did it all right. And so there's a lot of information over there, so I'm just going to give you a brief overview of what these documents are and how they contribute to the overall planning process. The existing conditions white paper report, that's probably the most lengthy one, but that established a baseline for the county and provides policy evaluation for regional planning, population and demographics, land use and development patterns, and economic development, housing, services and infrastructure, and transportation. So there's a lot to that document, but kind of gives a baseline for where we were starting at. The visioning and values document outlines those guiding principles that I talked about earlier and helps to guide how Cache County looks and feels in the future and represents the aspirational outlook of Cache County's land use development, public services, facilities, and economic development. And then, those last three documents are the outreach documents that highlight the public efforts that I talked about. Those may be interesting to dig into just so you can hear what maybe public feedback we've heard from each of those processes. And so what's next? We are going to a story map format for the plans. We're seeing a lot more plans go into this kind of digital element. It allows for them to be more interactive and maybe a little bit more usable. If you're not familiar with story maps, this is one that we had put together for our countywide services. And so it just provides an interactive, is a little bit more fun graphically to look at than a stagnant PDF document. We'll also provide a PDF copy as well, but this allows for ease of updating the plans pretty quickly as well, but just to give you an idea of what that will look like. And then finally, we will be holding a joint workshop session with the county council. Not sure the exact date on that yet.
The 30th, as far as we've been able to confirm.
Yes.
What day of the week is that? Is that Wednesday?
It's on Tuesdays.
It's not a Tuesday, it's a Wednesday.
So with that being said,
We're betting it through the commission. So if that doesn't work for most of you, that will change.
yeah.
Like March 30th, is that what you're saying?
So I want to bring this to you and, what would help the commission feel most prepared at this workshop session? What more do you want to see from staff to ultimately then be able to provide a recommendation on these documents to county council once we're ready for that public process? So that concludes my presentation. It's 9 p.m. on the dot. And so I'm here for any questions, but if you want to share thoughts on that workshop, of course I'll hear feedback, post this meeting too, but just want to get an idea of what would help the commission have a better understanding of what all these processes are. And so Chris and Tim.
Is that porcupine?
Looks like that picture. I just want to be clear, you are the recommending body to the council for this plan. And there are some expectations in the sense of your review of all these pieces. Now, there are members of this body who are part of the steering committee who have looked at this in more depth and researched, so you could probably lean on them a bit more. Jason Watterson and Chris Sands. And also Nolan Gunnell's participating with that group with David Erickson, and I think we've seen Barbara now and then. Do you remember Nolan? I've seen
No.
Was she there? I was on the phone last week, but the three I've been there.
Yeah, she was there this past, but yeah.
So there's some folks who are participating in that. Some of those documents that are there are lengthy, and they're not easy reads. So if there's something you want to dig into and understand better, at least I would cover the front executive summary type introduction stuff so you understand what the document is. Lauren's given a great overview of what they are, but if you wanted to stick a little more, I would dig in. and read at least the beginnings of those pieces.
So would you send out a link to the commission to this, so?
Yep, this yeah, I apologize, I didn't get it in there. I'm new to the Google Drive folder, so I apologize, that was my,
I checked, they're there.
the slides are?
This presentation, she's gonna put in.
Yeah, I'll put the presentation in there too, so.
Lauren, I started into it, and so I didn't get all the way through, but I found it very informative and helpful, and, yeah, I think it looks great. I'm a little partial because our cities try to redo our general plan too, and so I'm looking for ideas and how this works and how it, you know, what pieces come together, but from what I've seen, like, very well done, so.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm excited to.
Yeah, I appreciate that, yeah. Yeah, and like I said, you know, that joint planning council meeting, if you guys have ideas, like what would be helpful to you as a commission, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to, you know, just so I can formulate what I want to share at that joint workshop, so.
The council's very interested in meeting with the commission. That's been expressed by multiple council members. And even Nolan before mentioned that they really want to dig into CUPs. They're very interested in that. I asked that they kind of wait till we have the general plan discussion first. And they were kind enough to say, yes, let's focus on that for now. But they're very much interested in hearing, what do you want to talk about? What are your priorities? You are the planning commission. You can kind of set that tone for what the planning focus can be. Staff can help you. We can work together as a team and kind of figure out what those priorities need to be, especially as we move. We're going to have to gear up quite a bit as we move from general plan, these other long-range plans to implementation. That's where we're really going to have to see the rubber hit the road when we talk about what the commission's doing. We might need to talk about how we're structuring changes that might need to occur, but that's a little further into the future.
I was just going to mention, of the documents that Lauren placed in the draft general plan folder, one that might be particularly helpful as you identify which topics are of highest priority to you is the summary of the public outreach. I forget the title of that document.
From the survey.
From the survey. Yeah, and so some of you are familiar with that, others less so, but it's a good, it represents what has been processed through much of the process and then shared at a very refined point with many members of the public, and then level of support indicated with some context provided. So we'd encourage you to look at that one in particular.
Yeah, and if you really want to see some good copy and pasted, just comments from the public that weren't refined, you can go in there and read through, I think, about 20 pages of them. So good nighttime reading for really getting how the public feels about something. So
we'll get that information out to you to confirm if the 30th works for everyone. The council chair, Barbara Tidwell, is interested in trying to make sure that works for folks to attend. I think right now the anticipated time is 3 to 5. I think Tim is going to pass some stuff on. Tim's going to send out, if you haven't seen it already, just an invitation or a poll or whatever we're going to do there to see who can actually make that. If it doesn't work, we're going to reschedule it.
So earlier in the day, yeah, my conflict is that's what our local planning commission is meeting with our local city council for a workshop, but ours would be at like 6 or 7, so if that's 3 to 5.
I pushed that. It's a long day for you.
yeah, I was going to say, that's going to be a fun day for you.
It's something they wanted. I think it works better for their schedule. I'd push them to do it later because that usually works for folks who are working, right? And they still want to do it earlier in the day. So I will float it to everybody and see where we're at.
Okay. Thank you.
Anything else, staff? Anything else, commissioners? Okay, without objection, we'll stand adjourned. Thank you.
And the meeting, that's all it's for.
That's technically all it's.
I'll let you know.
You know, there's some discretion there.
People.
Yeah. No, it's been good.